Nero Wolfe and the Flight 913 Enigma. It was a Wednesday in late October, and the afternoon light falling through the windows of Nero Wolfe's office had that peculiar amber quality that makes even dust motes look dignified. I was at my desk working through correspondence, 3 declined invitations to galas Wolfe would never attend, a catalogue from an orchid supplier in Burma, and a letter from a former client thanking us for proving her husband hadn't murdered anyone, just embezzled from his own company, when I heard the soft clicking of claws on the front hall tiles. Apollo, the restless one of Wolfe's 5 Dobermans, had risen from his position near the front door. His ears were up, his sleek black head cocked at an angle that suggested something was approaching that didn't quite fit the normal pattern of foot traffic on West 35th Street. I glanced at my watch. 3:47. Wolfe was upstairs in the plant rooms with Theodore Horseman, conducting his sacred afternoon communion with the orchids. I had another 13 minutes before he'd descend in the elevator for his daily routine of settling behind his desk with a book and a bottle of beer. The other 4 dogs stirred. Caesar, the alpha, moved to join Apollo at the door. Mars positioned himself at the base of the stairs. Minerva and Diana flanked the hallway, creating what looked like a very elegant, very dangerous security perimeter. Then I heard it, the whisper of paper sliding under the door. I was up and moving before the envelope had fully cleared the threshold. By the time I yanked open the door, all I caught was a glimpse of a grey coat disappearing around the corner toward 9th Avenue. The courier, if that's what he was, moved like someone who delivered things to places where asking questions could prove hazardous to one's health. The envelope was cream-colored, expensive stock, unsealed, no postage, no return address. Just Nero Wolfe typed in capital letters across the front. I picked it up, closed the door, and stood there while Caesar sniffed at my hand, apparently deciding the envelope passed muster. The Dobermans had been part of Wolfe's household for 3 years now, ever since an Albanian client had paid his fee with 5 purebred puppies instead of cash. Wolfe had accepted them the way he accepted most disruptions to his routine, with irritation that gradually calcified into rigid affection. Inside the office, I opened the envelope, a single sheet of paper, same expensive cream stock. The handwriting was educated, angular, written with a fountain pen in black ink. "They will not let me land." That was it. No signature, no date, no explanation. I was still staring at it when I heard the elevator descending. Wolfe appeared at 3:59 and 30 seconds, as predictable as a Swiss watch with more mass. He navigated around Diana, who'd positioned herself strategically to be acknowledged, paused to run a hand over her sleek head, and settled into the custom-made chair behind his desk, with the kind of sigh usually reserved for martyrs and opera tenors. "Beer." "Fritz," he called toward the kitchen. Our chef's voice floated back. "Already coming, sir." Wolfe noticed me holding the paper. His eyes, barely visible behind the folds of his face, narrowed a fraction. "What's that?" "Courier delivery, hand-delivered about 2 minutes ago by someone who didn't want to be seen." "I'm not expecting anything." "That's what makes it interesting." I handed him the paper. He read it once, then again. Fritz appeared with a tray bearing a bottle of Remmers and a glass, both properly chilled. Wolfe poured carefully, watching the foam rise, then set the bottle down and picked up the paper again. "Gibberish," he said. "Maybe, but it's grammatically correct gibberish, written on expensive paper. It's aviation gibberish, which is worse. Some fool's idea of drama." He set the paper down and reached for his current book, A History of Byzantine Coinage. "File it."
Under what?
"Cryptic messages from desperate people. That folder's getting crowded." "Under N for nonsense." I was about to argue when the phone rang. I picked it up. Nero Wolfe's office, Archie Goodwin speaking. "Mr. Goodwin." The voice was male, cultured, and vibrating with barely controlled panic. "My name is Leonard Hastings. I must speak with Mr. Wolfe. Immediately, it concerns Flight 913. I covered the mouthpiece. Leonard Hastings says it's about Flight 913. He sounds like a man whose house is on fire, and the fire department just went on strike. Wolfe's expression suggested he'd just bitten into an orchid root. "Tell him I'm not available." "Are you sure?" "Because..."
"Archie,
His tone could have frozen the beer in his glass. "I am reading about the monetary reforms of Justinian. I am not interested in aviation matters, mysterious letters, or people named Leonard Hastings. Tell him no." I uncovered the mouthpiece. "Mr. Hastings, I'm afraid." "Please." The word came out strangled. "Flight 913 disappeared 6 hours ago. There were 4 people on board, including Senator Mitchell Carver, and I just received a message that suggests Mr. Wolfe knows something about it." I felt something cold walk down my spine. "What kind of message?" "A note, delivered to my office. It said, 'Ask Wolfe about landing.' That's all. Just those 4 words." I looked at the paper on Wolfe's desk. "They will not let me land." "Mr. Hastings," I said, "what time did flight 913 take off?" 1:45 this afternoon, from Teterboro. It was supposed to land in Montreal at 4:30. It never arrived. The FAA has nothing. Canadian Air Traffic Control has nothing. It just vanished. I did the math. The note under our door had arrived less than 10 minutes ago. The flight had been missing for nearly 2 hours. "Mr. Hastings, I think you'd better come see us. How soon can you be here?" "I'm in a cab. I'll be there in 7 minutes." He hung up. I replaced the receiver and looked at Wolfe, who had somehow managed to continue reading about Byzantine coinage while clearly listening to every word of my conversation. "You heard?" I asked. "I heard aviation nonsense compounding itself." He turned a page. "It remains nonsense. A US senator is missing. A private jet has vanished. Someone sent you a cryptic message about landing and sent someone else a cryptic message telling them to ask you about it. That's not nonsense. That's the opening chapter of something that's going to land on your desk whether you like it or not." "I don't like it." I noticed. "But here's the thing. Someone already decided you're involved. And in about 6 minutes, a man who sounds like he's holding on to his sanity with his fingernails is going to walk through that door." Wolfe set down his book. He looked at the paper again, then at me, then at Caesar, who'd settled near his desk and was watching him with those dark, intelligent eyes. "Very well," he said. "When Mr. Hastings arrives, show him in, but I promise nothing. Is that clear?" "Crystal." "And Archie?" "Yes. Have Fritz prepare coffee, strong coffee. I suspect we're going to need it." From upstairs came the faint sound of footsteps. Theodore moving between the orchid benches. Outside, the city rumbled its eternal rumble, and somewhere in the deepening October dusk, a plane that should have landed hours ago was either flying where it shouldn't be, or wasn't flying at all. Caesar lifted his head, ears pricked, a full 30 seconds before the doorbell rang. Leonard Hastings was 46 years old, though he looked older in the way that men do when their entire world has recently shifted 90 degrees off its axis. He had steel grey hair swept back from a high forehead, a Brooks Brothers suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and hands that wouldn't stop moving. They adjusted his tie, touched his briefcase, drummed against his knee, never still, never quite under control. I'd settled him in the red leather chair facing Wolfe's desk. Fritz had delivered coffee in our second-best service. Wolfe reserves the best for clients he's actually accepted, and Hastings had drained his cup in 3 gulps without apparently tasting it. Wolfe studied him, with the expression of a man examining a species of beetle he'd never particularly wanted to meet. "Mr. Hastings, you have 7 minutes before my dinner. Use them wisely." "I'm the Chief Operating Officer of Transmark Aviation," Hastings said. "We operate a fleet of private jets for corporate and government clients. This afternoon, Flight 913 departed Teterboro Airport at 13:45 hours, bound for Montreal. The aircraft was a Grumman Gulfstream, tail number November 73 Alpha Tango. Aboard were 4 passengers and 2 crew." He pulled a leather folder from his briefcase, extracted a photograph, and leaned forward to place it on Wolfe's desk. Wolfe didn't touch it, so I got up and looked. 4 people stood in front of a gleaming aircraft. I recognized Senator Mitchell Carver from his photographs in the Times, early 50s, silver-haired, the kind of face that suggests both competence and the ability to remember your name at fundraisers. Beside him stood a woman in her 30s wearing a severe black suit, and carrying a briefcase that looked heavy enough to contain state secrets. On the senator's other side was a man who had to be the reclusive billionaire the prompt mentioned. Late 60s, weathered face, eyes that suggested he'd seen most of what the world had to offer and found it wanting. The fourth passenger was younger, Mediterranean features, diplomatic bearing. Senator Carver, Hastings said, pointing. His chief of staff, Ramona Valdez. The other two passengers were Heinrich Volker, industrialist, very private, very wealthy, and Dimitri Castellanos, a trade attaché from the Portuguese embassy in Washington. And the crew? I asked. Captain James Thorne, 22 years experience, exemplary record. Co-pilot Robert Nguyen, 11 years, equally spotless. His hands were trembling now. They filed a flight plan for a direct route to Montreal. Estimated flight time 2 hours, 37 minutes. Weather was perfect. No mechanical issues reported. They made standard contact with departure control, acknowledged handoff to New York Center. And then, Wolfe prompted. Then nothing. They simply stopped transmitting. No distress call, no emergency beacon, nothing. The last confirmed radar contact was at 14:23 hours, approximately 73 miles northeast of Teterboro. After that, he spread his hands. Gone. Wolfe shifted his bulk. Search and rescue. Underway. The Cap has aircraft up. The Air Force scrambled fighters from Griffiths, and the Canadians have planes searching their side of the border. But Mr. Wolfe, here's what you need to understand. His voice dropped. 3 days ago, the FBI opened an investigation into Transmark Aviation. Someone, I don't know who, sent them an anonymous tip claiming we've been involved in smuggling operations. It's false, completely false. But the timing, he pulled out another document. This one, an official-looking letter with a federal seal. This morning, I received notification that our operating certificate was under review. This afternoon, one of our planes vanishes, and now I'm receiving messages suggesting that someone believes I'm responsible. What messages? I asked. Hastings reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He unfolded it carefully, as if it might explode, and placed it beside the photograph. The note was typed on plain white paper. Your flight won't land. Your career won't survive. You have 48 hours to confess. When did you receive this? Wolfe asked. It was under my office door when I returned from a meeting at 3 o'clock. And the message telling you to contact me? 15 minutes later, different paper, different typewriter. It said, ask Wolfe about landing. Wolfe picked up the note that had been delivered to our brownstone. He held both messages at an angle, examining them in the light from his desk lamp. After a long moment, he set them down. Mr. Hastings, why do you believe I can help you? Because someone wants me to ask you. Because you're Nero Wolfe, and you've solved cases that made no sense to anyone else. And because, his voice cracked slightly, because if that plane isn't found, or if it's found, and there's evidence of sabotage, my company is finished. My reputation is finished. I'll spend the rest of my life in a federal prison for something I didn't do. Perhaps you did do it. The words hung in the air like a slap. Hastings' face went white, then red. I did not sabotage that aircraft. I did not make it disappear. I have no idea where it is, and I would give everything I own to know that those people are safe. Yet the evidence suggests otherwise. The evidence is being manufactured. Hastings was on his feet now, coffee forgotten. Someone is framing me, Mr. Wolfe. Someone who knows about the FBI investigation. Someone who knew that flight's schedule. Someone who wants me destroyed. Wolfe leaned back, his chair creaking under his weight. He was silent for a long moment, eyes half closed. Mars had moved closer, positioning himself between Hastings and the door, not threatening, just watchful. Sit down, Mr. Hastings, Wolfe said finally. Your display of emotion is noted but unpersuasive. If you want my help, you'll need to provide information, not hysteria. Hastings sat, and I watched his hands clench into fists. Who knew the senator would be on that flight? Wolfe continued. The manifest was filed 48 hours in advance, standard procedure for government officials. His office would have known, obviously. My scheduling department, the flight crew, Volker's security team, Castellanos' embassy. That's not a small list. No. But the senator's movements aren't secret. He flies frequently. What was the purpose of this trip? Trade meetings in Montreal. The senator sits on the Commerce Committee. Volker has manufacturing interests in Quebec. Castellanos was facilitating discussions about Portuguese-Canadian maritime agreements. Routine? Completely. Wolfe was silent again, this time for so long that I thought he'd gone to sleep. Then the cargo manifest. Was there cargo aboard besides luggage? Hastings blinked. Yes. Some documents for the senator, secure pouches for the embassy, and a shipping container for Volker. What was in the container? I don't know. It was sealed. Volker's people handled it directly. Weight: 340 pounds. Wolfe's eyebrows rose a fraction. Substantial. Volker travels with equipment. Medical devices, I believe. He has a heart condition.
You believe?
His people don't share details. We transport what our clients need transported, Mr. Wolfe. We don't interrogate them about contents. Perhaps you should start. Wolfe reached for his beer, found the glass empty, and looked at it with disappointment. Mr. Hastings, I am not inclined to involve myself in aviation matters. They are invariably tedious, involving acronyms I refuse to memorize and regulations that make the Byzantine tax code look straightforward. But, however, Wolfe raised a finger. Someone has involved me without my consent. That annoys me. Someone has sent cryptic messages suggesting foreknowledge of a catastrophe. That intrigues me. And someone appears to be orchestrating an elaborate frame that offends my sense of justice. He paused. My fee is calculated at $50,000 for this investigation, plus expenses, half in advance. You will make yourself available for questions. You will provide complete documentation of your company's operations, flight schedules, and financial records, and you will not, under any circumstances, withhold information from me because you believe it might be incriminating. Do you agree? Hastings didn't hesitate. Yes. Then we have an arrangement. Archie, get Mr. Hastings' contact information and see him out. Then call Saul, Fred, and Ori. I'll need them tomorrow morning. I stood. You realize it's past your dinner time? I'm aware. Fritz made duck. It will reheat, unlike a case that's already 6 hours cold. I showed Hastings out, got his office and home numbers, and promised he'd hear from us. By the time I returned, Wolfe had the threatening note under his desk lamp, examining it with a magnifying glass he kept in his drawer. What do you see? I asked. A typewriter with a worn key. Common paper from a ream that could be purchased at any stationer. No distinguishing marks. No fingerprints. I suspect, though we'll send it to Inspector Kramer for confirmation. You think it's genuine? I think it's designed to appear genuine while revealing nothing useful. He set down the glass. But the message delivered to us, that's different. He held up the cream-colored paper. This is Crane's crest, available at perhaps 3 dozen stationers in Manhattan. The ink is Waterman's Florida blue. The handwriting is educated, possibly European in origin. Note the angular formation of the letters, the crossed sevens in the date notation, that isn't there but would be if this were part of a larger document. You're saying? I'm saying this was written by someone who wanted us to know something specific. They will not let me land. Not I cannot land. Not the plane won't land, but they will not let me. Passive construction. External agency. Conspiracy. I thought about it. You think it's from someone on the plane? Possibly. Or from someone who knew what would happen to the plane. He set the paper down carefully. Archie, when you call Saul, Fred, and Ori, I want them prepared for extensive field work. This case will require legwork that I cannot provide. Where do you want them to start? Teterboro Airport. I want to know everything about that flight. Who prepared the aircraft? Who loaded the cargo? Who had access to it in the hours before departure? I want the backgrounds of every person mentioned by Mr. Hastings, and I want to know who sent those messages. That's a lot of wanting. I contain multitudes. He stood, a process that always looked like a geological event. I'm going to dinner. While I eat, you will call Inspector Kramer and inform him we've received a communication possibly related to the missing aircraft. Be vague, be unhelpful, but be correct. We don't withhold evidence from the police. Even when the police are going to make things harder for us. Especially then. It establishes credibility. He moved toward the door, and Caesar fell into step beside him, a silent shadow. Oh, and Archie? Yes? This case troubles me. Because a plane vanished? Because someone went to considerable effort to make sure I knew about it. Someone who understands how I work, who knows that cryptic messages will pique my interest more than straightforward pleas. Someone who's playing a game. What kind of game? The kind, he said quietly, where people die. He left trailing Dobermans, like a king trailing courtiers. I sat at my desk, staring at the two notes, and wondered who'd decided to make Nero Wolfe a player in whatever was unfolding in the October sky. Outside, darkness was falling. Somewhere, a plane was missing, and somewhere, someone was very pleased with themselves. I picked up the phone to call Kramer and got ready to ruin his evening. Thursday morning arrived grey and cold, the kind of weather that makes you regret every decision that requires leaving a warm building. I was at Teterboro Airport by 8:30, having skipped breakfast except for 3 cups of Fritz's coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Saul Panzer had beaten me there. I found him in the terminal building, sitting in a corner booth of the small restaurant, reading a 3-day-old copy of the Herald Tribune, and looking exactly like what he was. The best freelance operative in New York City, possibly the country. He didn't look up when I slid into the booth across from him, just folded the paper and pushed a manila folder across the table. Morning, Archie. You look like you slept. 4 hours. Wolfe kept me up until 2 going over aviation regulations. Did you know there are 67 different federal statutes governing private air transport? I did not. Neither did I. I still don't, really. They all blurred together around midnight. I opened the folder. What have you got? Flight 913 manifest, crew backgrounds, and something interesting. The manifest was straightforward. 4 passengers, 2 crew, cargo list matching what Hastings had told us. But paper-clipped to it was a photograph of a man I didn't recognize. Late 30s, dark hair, wearing mechanic's coveralls with a Transmark aviation patch. Who's this? Malcolm Rivers, head mechanic for Transmark. He signed off on flight 913's pre-flight inspection at 12:45, exactly 1 hour before takeoff. And at 1:15, he was seen having an argument with someone in the hangar, heated enough that ground crew noticed. Then, he disappeared. Nobody's seen him since. I studied the photograph. Rivers had one of those faces that could blend into any crowd. Average height, average build, nothing memorable except his eyes, which had a sharp, watchful quality. Who was he arguing with? Nobody got a good look. White male, medium build, wore a hat pulled low, could be anybody. Or could be important. I closed the folder. Where's Fred and Ori? Fred's at Hastings' office going through employment records. Ori's tracking down the senator's chief of staff, Ramona Valdez. She has an apartment in Alexandria and an office in the Russell building, but she's not at either one. She's missing. She's on a plane that's missing. Her apartment's locked, her office is shuttered, and her assistant says she left instructions that she wouldn't be reachable until Friday, which would have been today if the plane had landed yesterday. I thought about that. Did she pack like she was planning to come back? Her assistant doesn't know. But here's something. Valdez requested the flight. Originally, the senator was going to take a commercial flight to Montreal. She's the one who arranged the charter, said it would be more secure for document transport. I felt that familiar tingle that means a case is starting to develop interesting angles. What kind of documents? That, friend Archie, is what nobody seems to know. The restaurant was starting to fill with the morning crowd, pilots grabbing coffee, ground crew coming off night shifts, business travelers looking both impatient and exhausted. I watched them, wondering if any of them had seen something they hadn't realized was important. Saul, You ever worked an aviation case? 2. Both involved insurance fraud. Both turned out to be simpler than they looked. You think this one's simple? No. He reached for his coffee. This one has too many moving pieces. Missing plane, federal investigation, anonymous threats, international passengers. Simple cases don't involve US senators. Or reclusive billionaires. What do we know about Heinrich Volker? Very little. And that's intentional on his part. Made his fortune in steel after the war, diversified into shipping and manufacturing, headquarters in Zurich, but he maintains homes in 6 countries. No criminal record, but that doesn't mean much. Men that rich rarely have official criminal records. What about Castellanos, the Portuguese attaché? Even less. Low-level diplomatic posting, trade facilitation, no red flags. Married, 2 kids, lives in Chevy Chase. By all accounts, a bureaucrat doing bureaucrat work. And yet, someone thought this particular combination of people was worth making disappear. I stood. Come on, I want to see the hangar where Rivers had his argument. We walked across the tarmac, past rows of private jets gleaming in the grey morning light. Teterboro was smaller than LaGuardia or Idlewild, more intimate, catering to the wealthy and the discreet, the kind of place where questions weren't asked and discretion was billed by the hour. The Transmark hangar was at the eastern end of the airport, a large metal structure with Transmark Aviation painted across the front in letters that had faded from repeated washing. A security guard sat in a small booth by the entrance, reading a paperback western and looking like he'd rather be doing anything else. I showed him my identification. Archie Goodwin, working for Nero Wolfe. We're investigating the disappearance of Flight 913. He set down his book with obvious reluctance. You and everybody else. FIA was here yesterday, FBI showed up at midnight, and some guy from the airline's insurance company has been wandering around since 6. That guy's still here. Inside, measuring things and making notes like he's going to solve the whole mystery with a tape measure. We went in. The hangar was cavernous, smelling of oil and metal and that particular cocktail of chemicals that surrounds aircraft. 2 planes sat in the middle of the space, both smaller than the Gulf Stream that had vanished. Maintenance equipment lined the walls, and in the back corner, a small office with glass windows overlooked the work area. The insurance investigator was tall and thin, wearing a suit that looked expensive but rumpled, as if he'd slept in it. He was crouched beside the landing gear of one of the planes, measuring something with calipers, and didn't look up when we approached. "You find something interesting?" I asked. He straightened, joints cracking. Up close, he was older than I'd first thought, mid-50s, with grey hair, and the kind of weathered face that suggested he'd spent considerable time squinting at wreckage. Depends on your definition of interesting. I'm finding that these aircraft are maintained to specification, properly documented, and show no signs of neglect or sabotage. What I'm not finding is any evidence that would explain how a plane could vanish from radar. You're with the insurance company? Philip Ashworth, Continental Aviation Underwriters. He didn't offer to shake hands, just tucked his calipers into a leather case. You're the detective? One of them, Archie Goodwin. This is Saul Panzer. We're working for Nero Wolfe. La, the fat detective who never leaves his house. He prefers edentriers and corpulent, but yes, that's him. Ashworth smiled slightly. I've heard of him, supposed to be brilliant. He has his moments. What can you tell us about Flight 913? Not much more than what's in the official reports. Pre-flight inspection was completed by Malcolm Rivers at 12:45. Everything checked out. Fuel, hydraulics, control surfaces, avionics. The plane was airworthy. Rivers is one of their best mechanics, very thorough. If he signed off on it, it was safe to fly. And yet, Rivers hasn't been seen since about an hour before takeoff. Ashworth's eyes sharpened. Where did you hear that? We hear things. It's our job. Is there any scenario where a mechanic could sabotage a plane in a way that wouldn't be detected during inspection? Several. He set down his case and leaned against the plane's fuselage. You could tamper with the fuel system, add water or contaminants that would cause engine failure after a certain flight duration. You could damage control cables in a way that would only manifest under specific flight conditions. You could plant an explosive device with a delayed trigger, but all of those require two things: expertise and time. Rivers had both. Motive. That's your department, not mine. I just assess probability and risk, and the probability that this plane simply vanished without mechanical cause is essentially zero. Saul had been walking the perimeter of the hangar, examining the workspace with his usual careful attention. Now he came back carrying something, a small metal cap, the kind that covers the end of a valve stem. This was under the workbench in the corner, he said. Recent scratches on it. Looks like it was pried off with a tool. Ashworth took it, examined it, and frowned. This is from a hydraulic reservoir cap, Flight 913's hydraulic system. Meaning if someone wanted to access the hydraulic fluid, this is what they'd need to remove first. He looked up at us. Did Rivers do regular maintenance on the hydraulic system? I don't know, I said, but I'm going to find out. We spent another 20 minutes going over the hangar, talking to mechanics who'd been on duty the day before, trying to piece together Rivers' movements. What we learned was this: Rivers had arrived at his usual time, 7 in the morning. He'd worked on routine maintenance for 2 aircraft, then moved to Flight 913 around noon. The pre-flight inspection had taken 45 minutes, during which time he'd been alone with the aircraft. At some point after that, he'd had an argument with an unidentified man, and then he'd vanished. Someone should find Rivers, I said to Saul, as we walked back toward the terminal. Already in motion. Fred's got contacts in the mechanics union. If Rivers is in New York, we'll find him. And if he's not in New York, then we'll find him wherever he is. It just takes longer. Saul stopped, looking back at the hangar. Archie, something about this doesn't feel right. The whole case doesn't feel right. No, I mean the timing. Rivers argues with someone at 1:15. The plane takes off at 1:45. That's only 30 minutes. If Rivers sabotaged the plane, he did it either before the argument or after. If before, why argue? If after, that's cutting it very close. Unless the argument was about the sabotage, then why not stop him? Why not call security? It was a good question. I didn't have a good answer. We were halfway across the tarmac when I saw him. A man standing beside a black sedan parked near the fence line, watching us. He was about 50 yards away, wearing a dark coat and hat, and there was something in the way he stood that was wrong. Too still, too focused. Saul, 10 o'clock, black sedan. Saul looked. I see him. He watching us? Yes. You recognize him? No. But I recognize the type. So did I. In our line of work, you learn to distinguish between civilians and professionals. This man was a professional. Question was, professional what? I started walking toward him. He watched me come, didn't move, didn't react. I was 20 feet away when he reached into his coat. Not fast, not threateningly, just a smooth, practiced motion, and pulled out something white. An envelope. He set it on the hood of the sedan, got in, and drove away before I reached the car. The whole thing took maybe 15 seconds. By the time I had the envelope in my hand, the sedan was through the airport gate and gone. Saul joined me. What is it? I opened the envelope. Inside was a single photograph. It showed the interior of an aircraft cabin. 4 passengers: Senator Carver, Ramona Valdez, Heinrich Volker, Dimitri Castellanos, all seated, all looking at the camera, all very much alive. On the back, written in pencil, yesterday afternoon, 14:45 hours. That was 3 minutes after the plane had disappeared from radar. I looked at Saul. He looked at me. I think, I said slowly, we need to get back to the brownstone. Wolfe's going to want to see this. Archie?
Yeah?
Whoever took that photograph, they were on the plane. I know. And whoever just gave it to us, they knew we'd be here. I know that too. We walked back to my car in silence. Behind us, Teterboro Airport continued its morning routine, oblivious to the fact that somewhere in the October sky, 4 people who should have been dead were apparently very much alive. And someone wanted us to know it. I made it back to West 35th Street by noon, having broken approximately 47 traffic laws and scared at least 3 taxi drivers into converting to safer professions. Saul stayed behind at Teterboro to coordinate with Fred and Ori, promising to call the minute they found anything worth reporting. The brownstone looked exactly as it always did, solid, dignified, and utterly indifferent to the chaos swirling around it. Minerva and Diana were positioned on either side of the front stoop, watching the street with that peculiar intensity that Dobermans have perfected over centuries of being very good at their jobs. Inside, I found Wolfe in the office, bent over his desk with a magnifying glass, examining what looked like maps. He didn't look up when I entered. "You're back early," he said. "I assume that means something interesting happened." Interesting is one word for it. I tossed the photograph onto his desk. "That's what someone hand-delivered to me at Teterboro about an hour ago." Wolfe set down his glass, picked up the photograph, studied it for perhaps 30 seconds, then flipped it over to read the notation on the back. His expression didn't change, but his eyes narrowed fractionally. "Explain." I told him everything. The missing mechanic, the argument in the hangar, the hydraulic cap that Saul had found, the insurance investigator's assessment. And I told him about the man in the black sedan, the way he'd waited for us, the professional manner in which he'd delivered the photograph and disappeared. When I finished, Wolfe set down the photograph and leaned back, his chair protesting. Caesar, who'd been lying near the desk, lifted his head and regarded me with those dark, measuring eyes. "Someone is communicating with us," Wolfe said finally. "That's one way to put it. They're telling us a story. First, they send us a cryptic message about landing. Then they ensure Mr. Hastings comes to us for help. Now they provide evidence that the passengers were alive after the plane supposedly vanished. Each piece of information is calculated to move us in a specific direction. What direction? That remains to be seen. But Archie," he picked up the photograph again. "Look at this carefully. What do you observe?" I took it back, studied it more closely. The 4 passengers were seated in what looked like the main cabin of a Gulfstream. Carver was in a window seat on the left. Valdez beside him, across the aisle. Volker sat with Castellanos. All 4 were looking directly at the camera. "They don't look distressed," I said. "No obvious signs of coercion." "Precisely. Senator Carver's expression is neutral, almost relaxed. Miss Valdez appears focused but not alarmed. Volker is unreadable. But then, according to Saul's research, he's always unreadable. And Castellanos looks, what would you say?" I looked closer. The Portuguese attaché's face was harder to read than the others, but there was something in his eyes. Resigned? No, that's not quite right. Expectant, maybe. As if he knew something was about to happen. "You think he was in on whatever this is?" "I think," Wolfe said carefully, "that we are dealing with a performance. This photograph is a message, but it's also a proof. Someone wants us to know these people are alive, or were alive at 1445. Whether they remain alive is an entirely different question." The phone rang. I picked it up. Nero Wolfe's office. "Archie, it's Fred. I found something in Hastings' employment records." "What kind of something?" "Malcolm Rivers was hired 8 months ago. Before that, he worked for a company called Aerotech Solutions in Newark. I called them. They said Rivers left to take a better-paying position. But when I pressed, the manager got cagey. Said there'd been some concerns about Rivers's associations." "What kind of associations?" "He wouldn't say over the phone, but he suggested I might want to talk to someone at the FBI. Specifically, an agent named Douglas Kellerman, who'd been asking questions about Rivers about 2 months ago." I covered the mouthpiece. "Fred found something on Rivers. FBI was investigating him." Wolfe nodded. "Get the agent's contact information. Call him. Be direct. We have information that may pertain to his investigation. See if he'll talk to us." I uncovered the phone. "Fred, get me everything you can on Agent Kellerman, and find out what the hell the FBI wanted with a mechanic." "Already working on it. One more thing," Ori called. He tracked down Ramona Valdez's assistant in Washington. Apparently, Miss Valdez withdrew $50,000 in cash from her personal bank account 3 days before the flight. 50,000, in hundreds, told the bank she was buying art from a private seller who only accepted cash. And the bank believed that. People believe all kinds of things when you have enough money. Fred paused. Archie, you know what this is starting to look like? Yeah, like 4 people getting ready to disappear. That's what I thought too. I hung up and relayed the information to Wolfe. He sat motionless for a long time, fingers interlaced across his middle belly, eyes closed. Caesar had risen and moved to the window, watching the street. Mars joined him. The 2 Dobermans stood like statues, silent sentinels guarding against threats that hadn't yet materialized. Archie, Wolfe said without opening his eyes, what do you know about passenger manifests for international flights? Less than I did 2 days ago, which wasn't much. Why? Because if I'm correct, the manifest for Flight 913 was incorrect from the moment it was filed. Not in terms of who was listed, but in terms of who actually boarded. You think there was a 5th passenger? I think there was a weight discrepancy. Mr. Hastings mentioned that Volker's cargo container weighed 340 pounds. That's remarkably heavy for medical equipment. Maybe he travels with a lot of equipment. Perhaps, or perhaps the container held something or someone else entirely. He opened his eyes. Get me the official cargo manifest from the FAA. I want the complete weight and balance calculation for that aircraft. And I want it within the hour. That's going to require calling in favors. Then call them. I'm also going to need Inspector Kramer's cooperation, which will be more difficult to obtain. You want me to tell him about the photograph? Not yet, but I want to know if the FBI's investigation into Transmark Aviation is genuine or manufactured. Kramer has contacts in the Bureau. He can find out. And if he asks why we're interested, tell him we're investigating a potential fraud case, which is true. Someone is perpetrating an elaborate fraud. The question is, who and why? The doorbell rang. Through the hall, I could see a shape through the glass panel, tall, heavy-set, unmistakably official, Kramer, as if we'd summoned him by speaking his name. That's either excellent timing or terrible timing, I said. With Inspector Kramer, it's usually both. Let him in. Inspector Kramer of Manhattan Homicide looked exactly like a man who'd spent the last 18 hours dealing with missing aircraft, federal agencies, and political pressure, which, as it turned out, he had. He stomped into the office without being invited, dropped into the red leather chair with a grunt, and glared at Wolfe. All right, what do you know? Wolfe raised his eyebrows. Good afternoon to you as well, Inspector. Would you care for beer? I'd care for answers. Flight 913. You received a message about it yesterday. You didn't tell us until late last night, after the damned plane had been missing for 9 hours. What else haven't you told us? I've told you everything I'm obligated to tell you. Obligated. Kramer pulled out a cigar, bit off the end, and stuck it in his mouth without lighting it. 4 people are missing, Wolfe. A US senator, a billionaire, a diplomat, and your client. Yeah, I know Hastings hired you. Don't bother denying it. Is under federal investigation for smuggling. You want to tell me what you're really working on? I'm working on determining whether Mr. Hastings has been the victim of an elaborate frame, or whether he's precisely as guilty as circumstances suggest. At present, the evidence points toward the former. What evidence? Wolfe hesitated. I knew that hesitation. It meant he was deciding how much to share, how much to hold back. Finally, he reached for the photograph and handed it across the desk. This was delivered to Archie this morning at Teterboro Airport. Note the timestamp. Kramer studied the photograph, his expression going from irritation to shock to something darker. Where did you get this? A man in a black sedan, professional demeanor, careful approach, executed the handoff without identification. He's gone now. And you waited until I showed up to tell me about it. I received it less than 2 hours ago. I've been analyzing its implications. And it suggests that whatever happened to Flight 913, it wasn't a simple crash or mechanical failure. Those 4 people were alive and apparently unharmed 3 minutes after radar lost contact with their aircraft. Kramer stood, the photograph still in his hand. I'm taking this. Of course. But I'd like a copy. You'll get one after it's been analyzed. And Wolfe, he pointed the cigar like a weapon. If you're withholding information, if you're obstructing this investigation in any way, Inspector, please. I have no interest in obstructing anything. I have considerable interest in solving a mystery that involves threats to my client, anonymous messages delivered to my home, and what appears to be a conspiracy of remarkable sophistication. Your client is under federal investigation, which is precisely why I'm investigating whether that investigation was prompted by legitimate concerns or by someone with a different agenda. They stared at each other across the desk, the immovable object and the irresistible force, locked in their eternal dance. Finally, Kramer turned to me. Goodwin, you're coming with me? Am I under arrest? You're being helpful. There's a difference. I looked at Wolfe. He nodded fractionally. Where are we going? I asked. Federal building. There's someone who wants to talk to you about mechanics, who argue with mysterious men, and then disappear. Agent Kellerman. Kramer's eyes narrowed. How do you know about Kellerman? We know lots of things, Inspector. It's our job. Then you know he's investigating Transmark Aviation for smuggling operations that may be connected to 3 other companies in 4 states. And you know Malcolm Rivers was on his radar as a person of interest. I knew the first part. The second part is news. Then consider yourself informed. Come on. I grabbed my coat. Wolfe had already returned to his maps, apparently finding them more interesting than federal agents. As I followed Kramer out, I heard him say, without looking up, Archie, be careful. Agent Kellerman may have information we need, but he also has an agenda. Don't reveal more than you learn. When have I ever? Frequently. I left him there, surrounded by Dobermans and documents, and followed Kramer out into the October afternoon. The federal building waited, full of agents who thought they knew what was happening. They were about to discover they didn't. Agent Douglas Kellerman was not what I expected. Most federal agents I'd met fell into 2 categories, the young and ambitious, or the old and cynical. Kellerman was neither. He was maybe 40, with sandy hair starting to grey at the temples, wire-rimmed glasses, and the kind of precise, careful manner that suggested he'd learned long ago that details mattered more than drama. We met in a conference room on the 6th floor of the federal building, a space that managed to be both sterile and oppressive. Kramer made the introductions with obvious reluctance, then took a seat at the table and lit his cigar, filling the room with smoke that violated at least 3 federal regulations. Mr. Goodwin, Kellerman said, shaking my hand with exactly the right amount of pressure. I understand you're working for Nero Wolfe. I am. And Mr. Wolfe has been retained by Leonard Hastings. Also correct. To investigate what exactly? Whether Mr. Hastings is being framed for something he didn't do. Kellerman smiled slightly. Direct? I appreciate that. Let me be equally direct. Our investigation into Transmark Aviation has been ongoing for 4 months. We have reason to believe the company has been used to smuggle high-value items across international borders. Documents, possibly. Technology. Maybe something more exotic. Drugs. We don't think so. The cargo manifests we've reviewed show legitimate business equipment, medical supplies, personal effects, nothing that would typically flag customs inspection. But there are patterns, weight discrepancies, unusual routing, flights that originate in one city, land briefly in a second, then continue to a third without any logical business reason. And you think Hastings knows about this? I think Hastings either knows about it or is monumentally incompetent. Given his background, Harvard Business School, 20 years in aviation management, reputation for attention to detail, I'm inclined toward the former. Kramer exhaled a cloud of smoke. Tell him about Rivers. Kellerman's expression tightened. Malcolm Rivers came to our attention 6 weeks ago. We received an anonymous tip that he'd been overheard discussing modified cargo containers with someone at a bar in Newark. The tip was specific enough that we looked into it. Rivers had worked at 3 different aviation companies in the past 5 years, each time leaving under ambiguous circumstances. Nothing serious enough to flag his FAA certification, but enough to establish a pattern. What kind of pattern? The kind where someone is very good at his job, but also willing to bend rules for the right price. Kellerman pulled a folder from his briefcase, opened it, and slid a photograph across the table. This is Rivers 3 weeks ago, meeting with a man we've been tracking in connection with illegal technology exports. The photograph showed Rivers sitting in what looked like a diner booth, talking to a man in his 50s with a weathered face and hard eyes. The man's hands were visible on the table, and I noticed something interesting. A ring on his right hand, heavy gold with some kind of insignia. Who's the other man? We don't know his real name. He uses several aliases, but he's connected to a network that specializes in moving sensitive materials out of the United States. Mostly technology, computer components, specialized manufacturing equipment, sometimes classified documents. And you think Rivers was helping him? We think Rivers was modifying cargo containers to create hidden compartments. Nothing elaborate, just false bottoms, doubled walls, spaces large enough to hide documents or small equipment. Kellerman leaned forward. Here's what troubles me, Mr. Goodwin. Rivers was scheduled to work on flight 913. He completed the pre-flight inspection, and then he vanished. Either he sabotaged that plane, or he witnessed something that made him run. Or someone made him disappear because he knew too much. That's option 3. Yes. Kramer shifted in his chair. Kellerman thinks the plane didn't crash. He thinks it was diverted. I looked at the agent. Based on what? Based on the fact that we found no debris, no emergency beacon signal, and no evidence of mechanical failure in the radar data. That plane was flying normally until it wasn't. And based on, he hesitated, based on other intelligence that I'm not at liberty to discuss. But you already know about the photograph, I said. Kellerman's expression didn't change, but his silence was answer enough. You've got someone on the inside, I continued. Someone who knew that photograph existed before Kramer brought it to you, which means you've been watching this situation develop, possibly orchestrating parts of it. Mr. Goodwin, which means, I said, ignoring his attempt to interrupt, that you knew flight 913 was going to disappear before it happened. You let it happen. You let 4 people, including a US senator, get put in danger because you wanted to catch whoever's running your smuggling operation. The silence that followed was thick enough to cut with a knife. Kramer was staring at Kellerman with an expression that suggested he was reconsidering his opinion of federal cooperation. Kellerman, to his credit, didn't try to deny it. We had intelligence that something was being planned, he said finally. We didn't know what. We didn't know when. We had agents positioned at Teterboro, but the operation moved faster than we anticipated. By the time we realized what was happening, the plane was already gone. Who told you something was being planned? I can't tell you that. Can't or won't. Both. He closed his folder. Mr. Goodwin, I'm going to share something with you in the hopes that you'll share information with me in return. This investigation isn't just about smuggling. It's about a network of people who've been using private aviation companies to move materials that could pose a threat to national security. We've identified 12 companies in 7 states that may be involved. Transmark is the largest, but it's not the most important. What is? A company called Atlantic Freight Solutions, based in Montreal. 3 of Flight 913's passengers had connections to that company. I felt something click into place. Which 3? Volker owns a 20% stake through a shell corporation. Castellanos facilitated customs arrangements for several of their shipments. And Ramona Valdez, he paused. Miss Valdez's brother works for Atlantic Freight Solutions as a logistics coordinator. You think she was part of whatever this is? I think she arranged that flight for a specific reason. I think she chose those specific passengers for a specific reason. And I think when that plane took off from Teterboro, everyone on board knew they weren't landing in Montreal. Kramer ground out his cigar. So where did they land? We don't know, but we're going to find out. Kellerman looked at me. I need to know what Nero Wolfe knows. Everything he knows. This isn't a game, Mr. Goodwin. These people are playing with fire. Mr. Wolfe doesn't play games, I said, but he also doesn't share information with federal agents who let planes disappear to protect their investigations. You want his cooperation? Give him something worth cooperating with, such as... such as the name of your informant, or the real reason you're so interested in Atlantic Freight Solutions, or what Senator Carver was really carrying on that flight. Because I'm betting it wasn't just documents for trade meetings. Kellerman stood. I'll need to make some calls. You do that. While you're at it, explain to your superiors that Nero Wolfe is now involved, which means this case is going to get solved with or without federal help. Your choice is whether you want to be part of that solution or an obstacle to it. I left him standing there and walked out with Kramer. We didn't speak until we were outside, standing on the steps of the federal building, watching the afternoon traffic crawl past. You believe him? Kramer asked. About being surprised by how fast it moved. Maybe. About not knowing where the plane went? No. He knows something he's not sharing. That's the thing about the feds. They always know more than they're saying. Speaking of which, you didn't seem surprised when Kellerman mentioned Atlantic Freight Solutions. Kramer pulled out another cigar, looked at it, then put it away unlit. I wasn't. We've had our eye on them for 18 months. Different reason than the FBI, though. We think they're connected to a series of thefts, high-value items disappearing from cargo shipments. Art, jewelry, that kind of thing. Never enough to make headlines, but consistent enough to establish a pattern. And you think Transmark is involved? I think a lot of people are involved in a lot of things that shouldn't be involved in. He started down the steps. Goodwin, tell Wolfe to be careful. This case has layers, and every time we peel one back, there's another underneath. People who operate at that level, they don't leave witnesses. I'll tell him, but you know Wolfe, being careful isn't really his style. Then you be careful for him. I've gotten used to having you two around to solve things when the department gets stuck. He walked away, leaving me on the steps. I stood there for a moment, watching the city flow around me, thinking about planes that vanished, mechanics who disappeared, and federal agents who knew more than they were saying. Then I went back to the brownstone, where Wolfe was waiting with more questions than I had answers. I got back to find the brownstone humming with activity. Fred Durkin was in the front room, going through a stack of financial documents that looked thick enough to stop a bullet. Saul was on the phone in the office, talking in that low, intense voice he used when extracting information from reluctant sources, and Wolfe was at his desk, surrounded by maps, cargo manifests, and what appeared to be flight path calculations scrawled on yellow legal pads. The Dobermans had arranged themselves strategically throughout the first floor. Caesar near Wolfe's desk, Mars at the front door, Apollo pacing between the office and the front room, Minerva watching the windows, and Diana stationed at the base of the stairs. They moved like pieces in a chess game, each one covering a specific zone. Wolfe looked up when I entered. Well? I gave him the full report. Kellerman's investigation, the connection to Atlantic Freight Solutions, the revelation that 3 passengers had ties to the Montreal company, and Kellerman's carefully worded admission that the FBI had known something was being planned. When I finished, Wolfe sat in silence for a long moment, his eyes half closed. Then he opened them and looked at Saul. What have you learned? Saul hung up the phone. Atlantic Freight Solutions is a privately held company incorporated in Quebec 3 years ago. On paper, it's a legitimate freight forwarding business, arranging shipments, handling customs, coordinating logistics. Revenue last year was approximately $4 million. Nothing extraordinary. And off paper? Off paper, it's interesting. The company has no physical warehouse. All their facilities are actually leased spaces in other companies' buildings. Their employees are almost all contractors, no permanent staff except for management. And their client list is very carefully curated. Small manufacturers, specialty importers, private collectors, the kind of clients who value discretion. Smugglers, I said. High-end smugglers, Saul corrected. These aren't people moving drugs or weapons. They're moving things that are valuable, but not obviously illegal. Art that might have questionable provenance. Technology that's not quite ready for export approval. Documents that someone would prefer not to be traced. Wolfe turned to Fred. The financial documents. Fred looked up from his stack of papers, his broad face creased with concentration. Hastings' company is bleeding money. Has been for 6 months. Nothing catastrophic, but enough that he's had to refinance twice and defer maintenance on 3 aircraft. The interesting part is where the losses are coming from. Almost entirely from one route. Which route? New York to Montreal, with occasional stops in Burlington or Plattsburgh. The same route Flight 913 was scheduled to fly. Those flights consistently show higher operating costs and lower revenue than any other routes Transmark operates. Higher how? Fuel costs are 20% above average. Maintenance hours are 30% higher, but passenger revenue is only about 60% of comparable routes. Fred pulled out a spreadsheet. Either Hastings is a terrible businessman, or someone's using those flights for something other than what's on the manifest. Wolfe was silent, his fingers drumming slowly on the desk. I knew that rhythm. It meant he was fitting pieces together, assembling the puzzle in that remarkable brain of his. The cargo container, he said finally. The 340-pound container that Volker brought aboard. Archie, did you obtain the weight and balance calculations I requested? I pulled the documents from my briefcase. I did. Had to call in a favor from someone at the FAA. But here they are. Wolfe took them, spread them across his desk, and studied them with the intensity of a jeweler examining a diamond. After a moment, he looked up.
There's your answer. Look at the numbers.
I looked. The weight and balance calculations showed the aircraft's total weight at takeoff, including fuel, passengers, luggage, and cargo. Everything added up correctly, except for one thing. The passengers, I said slowly. The total passenger weight is calculated at 920 pounds for 4 people. That's an average of 230 pounds per person, which is high for a manifest that includes 1 woman, Wolfe said. The standard calculation for weight and balance uses 170 pounds for adult passengers. Even accounting for winter clothing, 920 pounds for 4 people is excessive. Saul came over to look. You're saying there was a 5th passenger? I'm saying someone on that flight weighed considerably more than expected, or something that wasn't a passenger was included in the passenger weight calculation. Wolfe tapped the paper. The container that Volker brought aboard, it's listed in the cargo section at 340 pounds. But what if that's not accurate? What if the container was lighter, and the extra weight was redistributed to make the calculations balance? Why would they do that? Because, Wolfe said, a person in the passenger section draws less attention than a person in the cargo hold. The implications of that settled over the room like fog. Fred set down his papers. Saul stopped pacing. Even Caesar lifted his head, as if sensing the shift in the conversation. You think someone was smuggled onto that plane? I said, hidden in plain sight as a passenger, but listed on the manifest as cargo. Or vice versa. Someone listed as a passenger, who was actually cargo. Wolfe picked up the photograph that had been delivered to me at Teterboro. 4 people, 4 faces looking at the camera. But notice, they're seated in a specific configuration. Carver and Valdez on the left, Volker and Castellanos on the right. The standard configuration for a Gulfstream cabin allows for 8 passengers. Where are the other 4 seats? I looked at the photograph more carefully. He was right. I could only see 4 seats, 2 on each side of the aisle, but a Gulfstream should have shown more of the cabin. The photograph is cropped, I said, or taken from an angle that deliberately excludes the rear section. Because someone was sitting in the rear section, someone who wasn't supposed to be photographed, someone who is the reason Flight 913 never landed in Montreal. The phone rang. I picked it up. Nero Wolfe's office. Archie, it's Ori. I found something. What kind of something? The kind that explains why Ramona Valdez withdrew $50,000 in cash. She used it to pay for a passport. She already had a passport. She traveled with the senator regularly. Not her passport, someone else's. A woman named Rebecca Hartley, Canadian citizen born in Toronto, 34 years old. The passport was issued 6 weeks ago through a document broker in Montreal. Very high quality work, apparently diplomatic level forgery. How did you find this?
I didn't. Someone sent it to me.
Anonymous package delivered to my hotel room an hour ago. Inside was a copy of the passport application, a receipt from the document broker showing Valdez's signature, and a note. What did the note say? Asked Wolfe why she needed to disappear. I covered the mouthpiece and relayed the information to Wolfe. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes suggested he'd just confirmed a suspicion. Tell Ori to return immediately, he said, and call Inspector Kramer. Tell him I'd like him to join us for dinner this evening. 7 o'clock. Tell him it's important. He's going to ask why. Tell him I'm prepared to explain what happened to Flight 913 and who's responsible for its disappearance. That should suffice. I hung up with Ori and dialed Kramer. He answered on the second ring, sounding even more irritated than usual. What now, Goodwin? Mr. Wolfe requests your presence at dinner this evening. 7 o'clock. He says he's prepared to explain the Flight 913 situation. There was a long pause. He solved it. He says he has. Which, knowing Wolfe, means he probably has.
I'll be there. Should I bring anyone?
Just yourself. And an open mind. That's a tall order when dealing with Wolfe. I hung up and turned back to Wolfe. He'll be here. You want me to invite Hastings too? No. Mr. Hastings is a client, not a suspect. However, he pulled out his watch, checked the time, and replaced it. I would like you to invite someone else. Someone who will be surprised by the invitation, but unable to refuse it. Who? Agent Kellerman. Tell him I have information about Atlantic Freight Solutions that he'll find illuminating. Tell him if he wants to salvage his investigation, he needs to hear what I have to say. He's not going to like being summoned. I don't particularly care what he likes. He inserted himself into this case by allowing a plane to disappear under his watch. He can extract himself by listening to what I've discovered. I made the call. Kellerman, as predicted, was resistant, but when I mentioned Atlantic Freight Solutions and the promise of information about smuggling networks, he agreed, grudgingly. By 6:30, the brownstone was ready. Fritz had outdone himself: roast duck with cherry sauce, wild rice with mushrooms, asparagus with hollandaise, and a salad that looked like it belonged in an art gallery. The dining room table was set for 4 Wolfe at the head, 3 places for our guests. Kramer arrived first, at 6:57, bringing with him the smell of cigar smoke and suspicion. Kellerman arrived 3 minutes later, looking like a man who'd been dragged to a party he hadn't wanted to attend. I seated them across from each other, poured wine that they probably wouldn't drink, and waited for Wolfe. He descended from the plant rooms at 7 exactly, pausing in the doorway to survey his guests the way a general might survey a battlefield. Then he entered, settled into his chair with his usual careful precision, and reached for his wineglass. "Gentlemen," he said, "thank you for coming. We have much to discuss, but first we eat. Fritz's duck should not be insulted by premature conversation." And for the next 40 minutes, we ate. Fritz's duck was, as always, exceptional. The conversation was minimal. Weather, orchids, the general decline of civic standards. Nothing about missing planes or federal investigations. Wolfe had established the rules. Business came after dinner, not during. Finally, when the plates were cleared and coffee had been served, Wolfe leaned back in his chair and looked at his guests. "Now," he said, "let us discuss Flight 913 and why it never landed in Montreal." Wolfe took his time, the way he always did when he had an audience that needed educating. Kramer sat with his coffee cup halfway to his mouth, forgotten. Kellerman had pulled out a small notebook, preparing to take notes, then apparently thought better of it and put it away. "Gentlemen," Wolfe began, "we have been presented with what appears to be an aviation mystery. An aircraft departs on a routine flight and vanishes from radar. No distress signal, no debris field, no emergency beacon. The natural assumption is mechanical failure, followed by catastrophic crash. But that assumption is wrong." "We know it's wrong," Kramer said. "We have a photograph showing the passengers alive after the plane disappeared." "Indeed, which tells us that Flight 913 did not crash. It landed somewhere other than its intended destination. The question is why? And that question has a surprisingly straightforward answer, because everyone aboard wanted it to land somewhere else." Kellerman leaned forward. "You're saying this was planned?" I'm saying this was meticulously planned by people who understood aviation regulations, customs procedures, and investigative protocols. They created a situation that would occupy law enforcement resources while they accomplished something else entirely. What something else? Wolfe picked up his coffee cup, sipped, and continued. Let us begin with the passengers. Senator Mitchell Carver, publicly respected, but privately facing questions about campaign finance irregularities. His chief of staff, Ramona Valdez, competent, loyal, and in possession of knowledge that could destroy her employer's career. Heinrich Volker, industrialist with manufacturing operations in countries where export controls create profitable opportunities for those willing to ignore them. And Dimitri Castellanos, diplomatic attaché, whose position provides certain immunities and access. You're describing a conspiracy, Kramer said. And describing a convergence of interests. 4 people, each with their own reasons for wanting to disappear, temporarily or permanently, each with resources, each with something to protect or something to gain. I was standing near the door, watching the Dobermans. Caesar had positioned himself where he could see both the dining room and the front entrance. Mars was at the window. Diana near the kitchen. They were restless tonight, sensing something in the air. Here's what happened, Wolfe continued. 6 weeks ago, Ramona Valdez made contact with a document forger in Montreal. She needed a new identity, not for herself, but for facilitating a transaction. She paid $50,000, withdrew in cash to avoid creating a paper trail. That transaction was the beginning. Beginning of what? Kellerman asked. A plan to move something of extraordinary value across international borders without detection. Something that required careful coordination, precise timing, and the participation of specific individuals. Wolfe set down his cup. Inspector Kramer, in your investigation of cargo thefts, did you ever identify what was being stolen? High-value items, art, jewelry, sometimes documents. But never weapons, never drugs, never technology? No. Always luxury items or collectibles. Because those items don't trigger customs alarms, they don't require export licenses, and most importantly, they can be valued arbitrarily, depending on who's buying and who's selling. Wolfe shifted his bulk. Agent Kellerman, your investigation suggested that Transmark Aviation was being used for smuggling. You were correct, but you were looking at the wrong cargo. Explain. The 340-pound container that Volker brought aboard, ostensibly containing medical equipment, was the key. Mr. Durkin's examination of Transmark's financial records showed that the New York-Montreal route was consistently unprofitable. Why? Because the flights were never about legitimate passenger transport. They were about moving items that needed to avoid scrutiny. Kellerman's expression had gone very still. What kind of items? Art, primarily. Paintings, sculptures, antiquities. Items that had been stolen from private collections, museums, and estates. Items that were being transported to Montreal, where Atlantic Freight Solutions would handle their onward movement to buyers in Europe and Asia. You're saying Volker was running a theft and smuggling operation. I'm saying Volker was one participant in an operation that involved multiple people across several organizations. Atlantic Freight Solutions was the nexus, the company that coordinated logistics, arranged customs clearances, and maintained plausible deniability. Volker provided manufacturing facilities where stolen items could be temporarily stored. Castellanos used his diplomatic status to facilitate certain shipments, and Ramona Valdez, he paused. Miss Valdez managed the financial arrangements, ensuring that money moved between parties without attracting attention. Kramer set down his coffee cup hard enough to rattle the saucer. You're telling me a U.S. Senator's chief of staff was involved in an international theft ring? I'm telling you that Miss Valdez was managing information, not necessarily participating in theft. Her role was to ensure that documentation matched reality, just enough to avoid investigation, but not so precisely that irregularities would be noticed. Wolfe reached for papers on the side table, the documents I'd seen him studying earlier. The cargo manifests for Transmark's Montreal flights show a pattern. Each flight carried legitimate cargo plus one container that was slightly heavier than its contents should logically weigh. Those containers were Volkers. Inside them were stolen items, carefully packed, on their way to Montreal and then to buyers worldwide. Then why did the plane disappear? I asked. If this operation was working, why risk everything by faking a crash? Because, Archie, the operation wasn't working anymore. Agent Kellerman's investigation was getting too close. Inspector Kramer's theft investigation was identifying patterns, and most critically, Wolfe looked at Kellerman. Your informant, the person who told you something was being planned. That person was part of the operation, wasn't he? He was trying to extract himself before everything collapsed. Kellerman's silence was answer enough. Malcolm Rivers, Wolfe said. The mechanic who disappeared. He was your informant. He'd been modifying cargo containers for Volker, creating the hidden compartments. But he got nervous when the FBI started asking questions, so he made a deal, information in exchange for immunity. Except he didn't realize how deep the operation went, or how much the other participants had to lose. What happened to Rivers? I asked. I suspect he's dead, Wolfe said quietly. Killed sometime between his argument in the hangar and the plane's departure. The argument we've heard about, that was Rivers confronting someone, possibly demanding more money to stay quiet, possibly trying to back out. Either way, it sealed his fate. The room was very quiet. Outside, I could hear the usual city sounds, traffic, voices, the distant wail of a siren. Inside, 3 men sat processing the implications of what Wolfe had just described. You still haven't explained where the plane went, Kramer said. Haven't I? Consider the logistics. An aircraft takes off from Teterboro, flies north toward Montreal, then disappears from radar. Where could it have gone that would avoid detection? Canada has radar coverage. Canada has radar coverage along established flight corridors and near major cities, but between the US border and Montreal, there are vast stretches of territory, forests, lakes, small communities, with limited monitoring. An aircraft flying low below radar coverage could reach any number of locations. You're saying they landed somewhere in the wilderness? I'm saying they landed at a private airstrip, one of hundreds that exist throughout Quebec and Ontario for forestry operations, mining access, and remote transportation. They landed, transferred their cargo to ground vehicles, and then he paused. Then the aircraft took off again, this time with a different flight crew and a different purpose. Kellerman stood abruptly. You're saying the plane is still flying? I'm saying the plane is still in existence. Yes, where it is now, I cannot say with certainty, but the passengers are almost certainly no longer aboard. They've dispersed to their predetermined destinations, using forged documents, alternative transportation, and the chaos created by the supposed crash to mask their movements. This is speculation, Kramer said. You have no proof. I have patterns, Inspector. I have financial records showing systematic losses on specific routes. I have evidence of forged passports and large cash withdrawals. I have a photograph delivered to my associate by someone who wanted us to know the passengers were alive. And I have weight and balance calculations that indicate more was aboard that aircraft than what appeared on the manifest. Not enough for an arrest. Perhaps not. But enough to know where to look. Wolfe turned to Kellerman. Your investigation into Atlantic Freight Solutions, how close were you to obtaining search warrants? Very close. We have evidence of smuggling, but we've been waiting for a triggering event that would justify a comprehensive raid. Then I suggest Flight 913's disappearance is precisely that triggering event. If my analysis is correct, Atlantic Freight Solutions currently has in their possession items that were aboard that flight. Items that can be traced to specific thefts. Search their facilities, examine their shipping records, and most importantly, find out where that plane actually landed. Kellerman pulled out his phone. I need to make some calls. Use the office, I said. More privacy. He left. Kramer remained, staring at Wolfe with an expression that mixed respect and irritation in equal measure. You know what bothers me about this, Kramer said. I suspect you're about to tell me. If you're right, and you usually are, damn it, then we've got 4 people who faked their deaths, a mechanic who got murdered for knowing too much, and an international smuggling ring that's been operating under our noses for 3 years. That's a lot of crime. Indeed. And yet you're sitting here, calm as can be, like this is just another Thursday puzzle. It's Friday, I corrected. Shut up, Goodwin. Kramer stood. Wolfe, if this turns out to be another case where you're right and we all look like idiots. Inspector, I have no interest in making anyone look foolish. I have considerable interest in stopping people who believe themselves above the law. Wolfe paused. There is, however, one element we haven't yet addressed. What's that? Who sent us the photograph? Who delivered the messages? Who has been guiding us towards specific conclusions throughout this investigation? Wolfe looked at me. Archie, describe again the man who gave you the photograph at Teterboro.
I thought back.
Late 40s, early 50s, medium build, professional bearing. He moved like someone with training, military or law enforcement. Didn't speak, just delivered the envelope and left. And the courier who slipped the first message under our door. I only saw him from behind. Grey coat, quick movements. 2 different men, probably, which suggests coordination. Multiple people working together to ensure we received specific information at specific times. Wolfe was silent for a moment. Gentlemen, we are being manipulated. Someone wants this case solved, but not by law enforcement. They want it solved by me, in a manner that accomplishes some goal we haven't yet identified. You think there's someone else involved? Kramer asked. I think there's someone who understands exactly what happened to Flight 913, who knows where the passengers went, and who has chosen to use us as instruments of their own agenda. Before anyone could respond, Kellerman returned from the office, his face pale. Atlantic Freight Solutions' main office in Montreal was raided 45 minutes ago by the RCMP, he said. They found the stolen items, paintings, sculptures, jewelry, worth approximately $30 million. They also found documentation connecting the company to Volker, to Castellanos, and to someone else. Who? Wolfe asked. Leonard Hastings. The name hung in the air like an accusation. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. That's impossible, I said. Hastings hired us. He's the client. He's also, Kellerman said quietly, the person who owns 49% of Atlantic Freight Solutions, through a series of shell companies, but the trail is there. The Canadians just found it. Wolfe closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. Of course, how perfectly elegant. What's elegant about it? Kramer demanded. Inspector, think. Mr. Hastings comes to us claiming he's being framed. He provides just enough information to point us toward a conspiracy. He hires Nero Wolfe, the great detective, to investigate. And while we investigate, while we gather evidence, while we identify all the participants in his smuggling operation, Wolfe paused. While we do all of that, he's ensuring that everything can be traced to everyone except himself. But we just traced it to him, I pointed out. Because someone else wanted us to. Someone who's been feeding us information throughout this investigation. Someone who knew about the smuggling operation and decided to expose it, but only after ensuring that all participants, including Mr. Hastings, would be caught. Rovers, Kellerman said. My informant. Before he died, he must have set something in motion. Perhaps. Or perhaps there's someone else entirely. Someone we haven't yet identified. Wolfe shifted in his chair. Regardless, the immediate question is what to do about Mr. Hastings. Kramer was already moving toward the door. I'm going to arrest him. On what charge? Conspiracy to commit fraud, smuggling, murder if we can prove he ordered Rivers killed. You have evidence of that? Kramer stopped. Not yet, but I will. Then I suggest you obtain it before approaching Mr. Hastings. He's a careful man. He won't have left traces that lead directly to him. Everything will be filtered through intermediaries, shell companies and plausible deniability. So what do you suggest? I suggest, Wolfe said, that we find the plane, because when we find the plane, we'll find evidence that even Mr. Hastings' lawyers won't be able to explain away. Outside, Caesar barked once. Sharp alert. Mars joined him. Then Diana. The 3 Dobermans were at the window now, staring at something on the street. I went to look. A car had pulled up across from the brownstone, a dark sedan with tinted windows. As I watched, the rear door opened and someone got out. It was a woman, mid-30s, wearing a business suit and carrying a briefcase. Even from the window, I recognized her from the photograph. Ramona Valdez, the chief of staff who was supposed to be on a missing plane. She was walking toward our door. "Wolfe," I said quietly. "We have a visitor." He rose, a monumental effort, and moved to join me at the window. He watched Valdez approach, his expression unreadable. "Well," he said, "it appears the mountain has decided to come to Mohammed. Let her in, Archie. I suspect she has much to tell us." I went to the door, the Dobermans flanking me like an honor guard. When I opened it, Ramona Valdez stood on the stoop, perfectly composed, perfectly calm. "Mr. Goodwin," she said. "My name is Ramona Valdez. I believe Mr. Wolfe has been looking for me." That's one way to put it. "May I come in? I have information about Flight 913, information that's going to change everything you think you know." I stepped aside. She walked past me into the brownstone, past the dogs, past the skeptical federal agent and the suspicious police inspector. She walked into Wolfe's office like she owned it, set her briefcase on his desk, and looked at him with eyes that suggested she'd been planning this moment for a very long time. "Mr. Wolfe," she said, "let me tell you what really happened, and let me tell you why I needed you to solve it." Ramona Valdez didn't sit down. She stood in front of Wolfe's desk with the kind of controlled tension that suggested sitting would be a surrender. She wasn't ready to make. Kramer had his hand near his service weapon, not quite touching it, but making his readiness clear. Kellerman had positioned himself near the door, blocking any quick exit. I stayed near the window, watching the street. The sedan that had brought Valdez was still there, engine running, driver still inside, ready to leave quickly if needed. Wolfe settled back into his chair, regarding Valdez, with the expression he usually reserved for orchids that weren't blooming properly. "Miss Valdez, you were reported missing, presumed dead or kidnapped. Yet here you stand, apparently in excellent health. I'm curious to know how that transformation occurred." "I was never missing, Mr. Wolfe. I knew exactly where I was." She set her briefcase down and opened it, pulling out a manila folder. "And I was never in danger. Everything that happened, the flight, the disappearance, the investigation was planned by me." Kramer moved forward. "You're confessing to—" "I'm confessing to nothing, Inspector. I'm explaining." She looked at Wolfe. "May I sit now? This story is going to take some time." Wolfe gestured to the red leather chair. She sat, crossed her legs, and folded her hands in her lap with the precision of someone who'd spent years in rooms where every gesture mattered. "3 years ago," she began, "I discovered that Senator Carver was involved in something that would destroy his career if it became public. Not the campaign finance irregularities you mentioned, Mr. Wolfe. Those are real but manageable. This was worse, much worse."
What kind of worse?
I asked. "The kind that involves classified information being sold to foreign buyers. The kind that makes you a traitor, not just a corrupt politician." She pulled a photograph from her folder and placed it on Wolfe's desk. "That's the senator meeting with a man named Viktor Petrov, Russian intelligence, operating under diplomatic cover in Washington. The meeting took place 18 months ago at a private club in Georgetown." Kellerman came closer to look. "That's Petrov. We've had him under surveillance for 2 years, suspected of running intelligence operations, but we've never been able to prove it. Because he's very good at his job," Valdez said, "and because the people he works with, people like Senator Carver, are very good at covering their tracks." Wolfe studied the photograph. "You're saying the senator was selling classified information to Russian intelligence?" "Not directly. That would be too traceable. He was providing access, telling Petrov which committees were investigating what, which companies were likely to receive defense contracts, which diplomatic initiatives were being planned. Information that's technically unclassified, but enormously valuable to someone who knows how to use it."
And you have evidence of this?
"I have recordings, documents, Financial records showing payments to offshore accounts. I've spent 18 months collecting evidence, being careful, making sure everything would stand up in court. Then why not simply turn it over to the authorities? Valdez smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression, because I learned something interesting while I was investigating the senator. I learned that Heinrich Volker was using Transmark Aviation to smuggle stolen art. I learned that Dmitry Castellanos was facilitating those shipments through his diplomatic connections. And I learned that Leonard Hastings, the man who owns Transmark, was running the entire operation through Atlantic Freight Solutions. And you saw an opportunity, Wolfe said. I saw a way to expose multiple crimes at once while ensuring my own safety. Because, Mr. Wolfe, here's what you need to understand. The senator knew I was investigating him. He didn't know how much evidence I had, but he knew I was a threat. I had perhaps 2 months before he found a way to discredit me or eliminate me entirely. The room was very quiet. Even the Dobermans had stopped moving, as if they sensed the weight of what was being said. So you planned Flight 913, Wolfe said. So I planned Flight 913, Valdez confirmed. I needed all 4 of us on the same plane, the Senator, Volker, Castellanos, and myself. I needed Hastings's operation to be in motion, and I needed someone investigating everything at the exact right moment. Meaning me. Meaning you. She leaned forward slightly. Mr. Wolfe, you have a reputation for being thorough, relentless, and most importantly, incorruptible. You can't be bought off or frightened away. When you take a case, you see it through to the end. That's exactly what I needed. You orchestrated this entire scenario to manipulate me into investigating. I orchestrated this scenario to ensure that when Flight 913 disappeared, someone would look at all the pieces, the smuggling, the espionage, the financial crimes, and put them together in a way that would expose everyone involved. Kramer was staring at her with an expression somewhere between admiration and fury. You faked a plane crash. You triggered a federal investigation. You wasted hundreds of man-hours searching for a plane that was never in danger. Do you have any idea? I have every idea, Inspector, and I regret the resources wasted. But I don't regret the results, because in the past 48 hours, you've uncovered a smuggling ring worth $30 million, identified a U.S. senator selling classified information, and exposed an aviation company that's been facilitating international crime for 3 years. Was that not worth some misdirection? People died, I said. Malcolm Rivers is dead. For the first time, Valdez's composure cracked. Just slightly. Just for a moment. Rivers was the one variable I couldn't control. He was working with the FBI, yes, but he was also getting nervous, making demands. When he confronted Hastings' people in that hangar, she stopped. I didn't order his death. I didn't want anyone to die. But I can't control everything, Mr. Goodwin. I could only control what I could control. Wolfe was silent for a long moment, his eyes half closed. Then, where is the plane now? On a private airstrip near Sherbrooke, Quebec. The crew that flew it there, genuine pilots, not the regular Transmark crew, are being paid to keep it secure until law enforcement arrives. You'll find evidence aboard. Volker's cargo container, for one thing. It contains 3 paintings stolen from a private collection in Boston 6 months ago. And the passengers? Dispersed. Volker is in custody in Montreal. The RCMP arrested him this morning, based on an anonymous tip that provided his exact location. Castellanos turned himself in to the Portuguese embassy in Ottawa, claiming diplomatic asylum. He won't get it, but it keeps him off the streets. And Senator Carver, she paused. The senator is currently in a safe house outside Montreal, waiting for federal agents to arrive. I've provided his location to Agent Kellerman's superiors. Kellerman pulled out his phone, checked it, and nodded. Confirmed. We have agents moving on Carver's location now. And you? Wolfe asked Valdez. What happens to you? That depends on Inspector Kramer, I suppose. I've committed fraud, filed false reports, conspired to deceive federal investigators. Those are crimes, but I've also exposed multiple criminals who were operating with impunity. I imagine a prosecutor could be convinced that my cooperation is worth more than my incarceration. Kramer looked like he was chewing glass. You're asking for immunity. I'm asking for proportionality. I did what I had to do to survive and to expose crimes that law enforcement wasn't catching. If that makes me a criminal, then charge me. But if it makes me a witness with valuable information, she let the sentence hang. Wolfe shifted in his chair. Miss Valdez, you've explained what happened and why, but you haven't explained one crucial element. What's that? Leonard Hastings. He hired me to investigate. He claimed he was being framed. Was he genuinely unaware of your plan, or was he participating in it? Valdez's smile returned. Mr. Wolfe, Leonard Hastings is many things: smuggler, criminal, conspirator. But he's not stupid. He suspected something was wrong the moment I arranged Flight 913. He's been scrambling for 48 hours, trying to figure out what I was planning, how much evidence I had, and how to protect himself. Then why hire me? Because I encouraged him to. I sent him one of those anonymous messages, unsigned, untraceable, suggesting that if he wanted to avoid prison, he needed to hire the best detective in New York to prove his innocence. He took the bait because he believed you'd investigate the obvious suspects, Volker Castellanos, the senator, and never look too closely at Transmark itself. He was wrong. He was wrong. You're too thorough for that. You looked at everything, which is exactly what I needed you to do. Wolfe was quiet again, thinking. Apollo had moved to the door, watching the street. Mars joined him. Something had their attention. Miss Valdez, Wolfe said, you've been remarkably forthcoming. That suggests you believe you're now safe from retaliation. But consider, Mr. Hastings knows you orchestrated this. He knows you've provided evidence against him. He knows that his empire is collapsing. Men in that position often become desperate. I've taken precautions. Have you taken sufficient precautions? Before she could answer, Apollo barked, sharp, urgent. Through the window, I saw the sedan that had brought Valdez suddenly accelerate, tires squealing as it left. And I saw something else. Two men, moving quickly along the sidewalk toward the brownstone, hands in their coats. Down, I shouted. The front window exploded inward as gunfire erupted. Not wild, not panicked, but precise and professional. The shots were aimed high, over where we'd be if we dropped to the floor, clearly meant to drive us into cover rather than kill immediately. I hit the floor behind Wolfe's desk, pulling Valdez down with me. Kramer had his weapon out, moving toward the window. Kellerman was already on his phone, calling for backup. The Dobermans didn't bark again. They simply moved Caesar and Mars toward the front door, positioning themselves between the shooters and the entrance. Diana and Minerva flanked the sides of the room, ready to intercept anyone who came through the windows. Apollo remained near Wolfe, who'd somehow made it to the floor behind his desk with surprising speed for a man of his size. How many? Wolfe demanded, his voice remarkably steady. 2 outside, I said. Maybe more in reserve. Professional shooters. They're not trying to kill us yet, just pin us down. Mr. Hastings' people, good bet. More shots, then silence. Through the shattered window, I could hear shouting, one of the shooters calling to the other. Then the sound of a car engine, close by. They're bringing up a vehicle, Kramer said. He was at the window now, weapon ready. They're going to try to extract Valdez, or make sure she doesn't talk, either way. The front door crashed open. But it wasn't the shooters, it was Saul Panzer, followed by Fred Durkin, both armed, both moving with the kind of smooth efficiency that comes from years of knowing your business. Saw them setting up, Saul said, not even breathing hard, called it in, then decided not to wait. Fred, cover the back. Fred disappeared toward the kitchen. Saul positioned himself at the broken window, covering the street. The car outside, a black SUV, was pulling up in front of the brownstone. The rear door opened, and someone stepped out. Not one of the shooters, someone else. Leonard Hastings. He stood on the sidewalk, hands empty and visible, looking up at the brownstone. Even from inside, I could see his face, pale, desperate. The face of a man who'd watched his entire world collapse in 48 hours. Wolfe, he shouted. I know she's in there. Send her out. Wolfe, still on the floor, looked at Valdez. Is there something you haven't told us? Hastings believes I have documents that implicate him in Malcolm Rivers' murder, Valdez said quietly. Documents that would ensure a conviction. He's right. Where are these documents? In a safe deposit box, with instructions to deliver them to law enforcement if anything happens to me. Dead man's switch, I said. Classic. Classic and effective. Except, she looked toward the window. Except Hastings is desperate enough not to care about consequences anymore. He just wants to eliminate the threat. Wolfe managed to lever himself to a sitting position against the desk, breathing heavily. Then we have a problem. Mr. Hastings has essentially laid siege to my brownstone. Inspector Kramer, I assume backup is coming? 5 minutes out. But 5 minutes is a long time when someone's shooting at you. Indeed. Wolfe looked at me. Archie, I need you to do something inadvisable. Those are my favorite kind of things. Go upstairs. Second floor, front bedroom. In the closet, there's a box. Bring it down. I knew the box he meant. Wolfe had been given it years ago by a client, a former military officer who'd insisted Wolfe needed better security than locks and Dobermans. Wolfe had accepted it reluctantly and put it away, claiming he'd never use it. I crawled to the door, staying low, and made it to the stairs. The second floor was dark, quiet. I found the box exactly where Wolfe said it would be. Heavy, metal, locked with a combination he'd told me once, and which, miraculously, I remembered. Inside were 3 things: a flare gun, a megaphone, and a small canister labeled CS Agent Military Grade. Tear gas. I brought the box down. Wolfe looked at its contents and nodded. Mr. Hastings has made a tactical error, he said. He's positioned himself in the street, with limited cover and limited visibility. Inspector, do you have authority to deploy chemical agents against an active shooter? In a situation like this? Absolutely. Then I suggest you warn him. Give him one chance to surrender. If he refuses, Wolfe looked at me.
Archie, you know how to use the flare gun.
Point and shoot. Essentially, aim for the street near his position. The canister will deploy on impact. The gas will incapacitate everyone within 30 feet, including his shooters. And if he runs, then the Dobermans will track him. They're trained for pursuit. I looked at Caesar, who was still at the door, watching the street with that intense focus. Mars beside him. Both dogs were coiled springs, ready to release. Kramer moved to the window, megaphone in hand. Leonard Hastings, this is Inspector Kramer, NYPD. You are surrounded. Throw down your weapons and surrender. Hastings' response was to gesture to his shooters. More gunfire, this time sustained, raking the front of the brownstone. The remaining windows shattered. Plaster dust filled the air. That's a no, I said. Deploy the gas, Wolfe ordered. I moved to the window, flare gun loaded. The gas canister was attached to a modified flare that would deploy on impact. Military grade meant it would spread fast and hit hard, designed to incapacitate without killing. I aimed for the street 10 feet from where Hastings stood, behind his SUV. I fired. The flare arced through the October evening, trailing smoke. It hit the pavement and exploded in a white cloud that spread with unnatural speed. Within seconds, the entire street was obscured. I heard coughing, shouting, the sound of men stumbling, then silence. Now Wolfe said to Caesar. The Doberman didn't need to be told twice. He was through the broken window in one fluid leap, Mars right behind him. Through the gas cloud, I could hear barking, not vicious but purposeful, the sound of pursuit. Kramer was already moving out the front door, weapon drawn, calling for his backup. Kellerman followed. Saul stayed at the window, covering them. 5 minutes later, it was over. Leonard Hastings was on the ground, hands cuffed behind his back, coughing from the gas. His 2 shooters were similarly restrained. Caesar and Mars stood over them, silent guardians, ready to act if needed. Backup arrived. 3 police cars, sirens wailing, an ambulance for the gas exposure, federal agents for Kellerman, The street became a circus of flashing lights and official activity. Inside the brownstone, Wolfe sat in his chair. Somehow he'd made it back into it during the chaos, surrounded by broken glass, plaster dust, and the wreckage of what had been a perfectly acceptable Friday evening. "My windows," he said mournfully. "Fritz will be devastated." "Fritz will be relieved we're alive," I pointed out. "That's a secondary concern." The windows were original to the building. Valdez was still in the red leather chair, remarkably composed for someone who'd just survived a gunfight. "Mr. Wolfe, I owe you an apology." "You owe me considerably more than an apology. You owe me new windows, a new carpet, and compensation for the considerable distress you've caused to my household. I'll see what I can arrange." "You'll arrange it precisely, or I'll ensure that Inspector Kramer knows every detail of your conspiracy, including the parts that might not qualify for immunity." She smiled slightly. "Understood." Kramer came back inside, looking exhausted but satisfied. "Hastings is talking, singing like a canary, actually. He's giving up names, locations, financial records, trying to make a deal." "Will he get one?" Wolfe asked. "Not from me. Maybe from the feds." He looked at Valdez. "You too. You're coming with me." "Am I under arrest?" "You're being detained for questioning. Call it protective custody, if it makes you feel better." She stood, collected her briefcase, and looked at Wolfe. "Thank you, Mr. Wolfe. I know you didn't choose to be involved in this, but I chose you for a reason. You're exactly what everyone says you are." "And what is that?" "Incorruptible, thorough, and unwilling to let any mystery remain unsolved, even when solving it is inconvenient." She left with Kramer, flanked by police officers. Kellerman followed, still on his phone, coordinating with agents in Montreal and Washington. Finally, it was just me and Wolfe in the damaged office. The Dobermans had returned, settling into their usual positions as if nothing unusual had happened. Fritz appeared in the doorway, surveyed the destruction, and sighed the sigh of a man who'd seen similar situations before and knew they'd happen again. "I'll call the glazier," he said, "and prepare supper. Late supper, but still supper." He disappeared toward the kitchen. Wolfe leaned back in his chair, eyes closed. "Archie,
Yes?
remind me never to accept a case involving aviation again. I'll make a note. And remind me to charge Miss Valdez triple our usual fee for this catastrophe. Already in the works." He opened his eyes. "Did we solve it?" "We solved it. Hastings will go to prison. Volker and Castellanos are in custody. Senator Carver's career is over, and he'll probably face espionage charges. The smuggling ring is exposed, and we survived a gunfight in our own office. Then I suppose it counts as a success. By our standards. Absolutely." He reached for his beer. Miraculously, the bottle had survived the gunfight intact, and poured carefully. "This case troubles me, Archie." "Because we were manipulated?" "Because we were manipulated successfully. Miss Valdez understood precisely how to engage my interest, how to guide my investigation, how to ensure I would uncover exactly what she wanted uncovered. That level of understanding suggests she studied us carefully. Should that worry us? It worries me that someone could orchestrate such an elaborate scheme with us, as unwitting participants. It suggests vulnerabilities in our methods. Or it suggests that sometimes people need help exposing crimes that law enforcement can't touch, and they choose us because we're good at what we do." He considered that. "Perhaps. But I dislike being used, even for righteous purposes. Then next time, we'll see it coming." "Will we?" I didn't have an answer for that. Outside, the police were clearing the scene. The broken glass was being swept up. The neighbors who'd emerged to gawk were being sent back inside. West 35th Street was returning to its usual state of urban tranquility, as if gunfights and missing planes were just normal Friday evening entertainment. Wolfe drank his beer. Fritz worked in the kitchen. The Dobermans dozed in their positions. And I sat at my desk, making notes for the case file, knowing that tomorrow there would be more questions to answer, more statements to give, more details to sort through. But tonight, Flight 913 was no longer missing. The mystery was solved. And Nero Wolfe had once again proven that mysteries, even mysteries involving aviation, which he loathed, could not withstand his methodical genius. Even if that genius had been carefully manipulated by a desperate woman with her own agenda. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of brilliant autumn sunlight that makes you forget there are bullets embedded in your brownstone's facade. I was up early. Too early for someone who'd spent the previous evening diving behind furniture while professional shooters tried to turn our office into Swiss cheese. But sleep had proven elusive. The glazier had promised to arrive by 9. Fritz was already in the kitchen, preparing what smelled like enough breakfast to feed a small army, and Wolfe, of course, was in the plant rooms, where violence and conspiracy couldn't disturb his communion with the orchids. I was at my desk, typing up notes from last night's excitement, when the phone rang. Nero Wolfe's office, Archie Goodwin speaking. Mr. Goodwin, the voice was male, accented, Eastern European, maybe Russian. I am calling on behalf of someone who wishes to speak with Mr. Wolfe. It concerns Flight 913. Flight 913 is solved. Case closed. Bills are being prepared as we speak. Not entirely solved. There remains one element that Mr. Wolfe has not yet addressed. I felt that familiar tingle that meant complications were incoming. What element? The gentleman who delivered the photograph to you at Teterboro Airport, and the person who provided information to Miss Valdez throughout her investigation. These are the same individual. And he wishes to meet with Mr. Wolfe today, at a location outside Manhattan. Mr. Wolfe doesn't leave the brownstone. Yes, we know. His agoraphobia is well documented. However, this matter is sufficiently important that we believe he'll make an exception.
We?
A figure of speech. Will you convey the message? I'll convey it. But I'm not promising anything. The location is the private airfield near Teterboro, where Transmark Aviation maintains its maintenance hangar. 12 noon. Come alone, just you and Mr. Wolfe. If you bring police or federal agents, my employer will disappear, and you'll never learn what he has to tell you. Your employer have a name? He'll introduce himself when you arrive. The line went dead. I sat there, staring at the phone, knowing that Wolfe was going to hate this. Hate it with a passion reserved for disruptions to his schedule, threats to his comfort, and anything requiring him to venture beyond the boundaries of West 35th Street. At 11, when he descended from the plant rooms, I gave him the message. His expression went through several stages: irritation, refusal, consideration, and finally, surprisingly, resignation. Very well, he said. I blinked. Very well? That's it? No argument? No insistence that anyone who wants to speak with you can come here? Archie. Someone orchestrated this entire case with remarkable precision. Someone provided Miss Valdez with information she couldn't have obtained on her own. Someone ensured we received photographs and messages at precisely the right moments. I want to know who, and I want to know why. You realize this could be a trap? Everything is potentially a trap. That's why we'll bring the dogs. All 5? All 5. If someone wants to harm us in the presence of 5 highly trained Dobermans, they're welcome to try. So at 11:30, we loaded into the Heron sedan, Wolfe in back with Caesar and Mars, me driving with Apollo beside me, and Minerva and Diana in the way back, alert and watchful. The drive to Teterboro took 40 minutes, during which Wolfe maintained the rigidity of a man, convinced he was making a terrible mistake, but determined to see it through. The private airfield was exactly where the caller had indicated. A small strip of asphalt behind the Transmark hangar, accessible through a security gate that stood open. No guards, no barriers, just an invitation into what could very well be an ambush. I drove through slowly, scanning for threats. The airfield was empty, except for a single aircraft. A small jet, sleek and expensive, with tail number November 123 Alpha Bravo. And standing beside it, hands in his pockets, was a man I'd never seen before. He was perhaps 60, with iron-grey hair and the kind of weathered face that suggested he'd spent considerable time in places where comfort was a luxury. He wore a well-tailored suit, European cut, and moved with the careful precision of someone who'd learned long ago that careless movements got you killed. I parked 50 feet away, keeping the engine running. The Dobermans were already alert, sensing something unusual. The man walked toward us, stopped at a respectful distance, and waited. Wolfe opened his door, a monumental effort as always, and extracted himself from the sedan. The dogs emerged with him, forming their protective phalanx. I came around to join them, one hand near the weapon I'd started carrying after last night's festivities. "Mr. Wolfe," the man said. His accent was indeed Eastern European, but more refined than I'd expected. "Thank you for coming. I know this represents a significant disruption to your routine." "It does," Wolfe said. "Therefore I suggest you make it worthwhile. Who are you?" "My name is Alexander Petravich. I am, or rather, I was, an intelligence officer with the Yugoslav government. Specifically, I worked in counterintelligence operations focused on identifying Soviet intelligence networks in Western Europe and North America."
Was?
"I retired 8 years ago when my country began to dissolve. Retirement, however, proved unsatisfying, so I established a private intelligence service, providing information to clients who value accuracy and discretion." Wolfe shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable standing in an open airfield. "And what is your connection to Flight 913? "I was hired by Ramona Valdez 18 months ago. She came to me through a mutual contact, seeking information about Senator Carver's activities. Specifically, she wanted to know if he was passing classified information to foreign intelligence services." "And was he?" "Yes. To Russian intelligence primarily, but also to several other buyers, Chinese, Israeli, even British. The senator was remarkably indiscriminate in his treachery." Petravich pulled out a cigarette case, offered it to Wolfe, who declined, and lit one for himself. "Miss Valdez paid me well for this information, but as I investigated the senator, I discovered something interesting: the smuggling operation. Precisely, he enriched Volker's art theft and smuggling network. Leonard Hastings's involvement through Atlantic Freight Solutions, Dmitry Castellanos' use of diplomatic immunity to facilitate illegal shipments. It was all connected, not organizationally, but by proximity. These people operated in the same circles, used the same resources, occasionally helped each other." "And you saw an opportunity?" Petravich smiled. "I saw several people who deserved to be exposed, but I also saw a problem. Ms. Valdez could expose Senator Carver, but she couldn't safely expose Volker or Hastings without making herself a target. She needed protection, she needed confusion, and most importantly, she needed someone who could investigate all the pieces simultaneously and assemble them into a coherent picture. Meaning me."
"Meaning you?"
"Miss Valdez chose you based on my recommendation. I studied your methods, Mr. Wolfe. I read accounts of your cases. I concluded that you were precisely the kind of investigator who wouldn't stop until every element was understood." Wolfe was silent for a long moment, watching Petravich with those half-closed eyes that suggested he was processing everything, evaluating every word. "You delivered the photograph at Teterboro." "I did." "And you slipped the original message under my door." "Guilty again." "And you provided information to Agent Kellerman's investigation, ensuring the FBI would be positioned to move when the evidence became available." "You're 3 for 3, Mr. Wolfe." "Then I have one question. Why reveal yourself now? You could have remained anonymous, enjoyed your success from a distance." Petravich took a long drag on his cigarette. "Because I owe you an explanation. You were manipulated, Mr. Wolfe. Used as a tool in someone else's operation. That's disrespectful to a man of your abilities. I wanted to explain why, and to apologize." "I don't want apologies. I want to know what you weren't telling us, because there's something else, something beyond the smuggling, beyond the espionage, beyond everything we've uncovered so far." Petravich's expression changed, just slightly, but enough to confirm Wolfe's suspicion. "You're very perceptive." "I'm very thorough. What didn't you tell us?" "Malcolm Rivers, the mechanic who died. He wasn't killed by Hastings's people. The airfield was very quiet. Even the wind seemed to have stopped." "Then who killed him?" I asked.
I did.
The words hung in the air like an accusation. The Doberman stirred, sensing the change in atmosphere. Caesar moved closer to Wolfe. protective. "Explain," Wolfe said, his voice very quiet. Rivers was the FBI's informant. Yes, but he was also planning to sell information to Volker, information about Valdez's investigation, about what she'd discovered regarding the senator. Rivers was a mercenary at heart, willing to work for whoever paid most. I couldn't allow him to compromise Miss Valdez's plan. "So you murdered him." "I eliminated a threat. In my former profession, we called it neutralizing assets. The terminology may vary, but the result is the same." Petravich looked at Wolfe steadily. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, Mr. Wolfe. I'm explaining what happened. And you're confessing to murder on an open airfield, in front of witnesses, because what? You believe I'll understand?" "I'm confessing because I'm leaving the country. That jet behind me will take off in approximately 10 minutes. By the time you report this conversation to Inspector Kramer, I'll be in international airspace, headed somewhere that doesn't have an extradition treaty with the United States. You think I'll let you leave? I think you'll weigh the value of arresting me against the value of the information I've provided." Malcolm Rivers was planning to compromise an operation that exposed a U.S. senator's treason, a multi-million-dollar smuggling ring, and several people who believed themselves above the law. His death, while regrettable, prevented considerably more damage. Wolfe stared at him for a long moment. Then he turned to me. "Archie, your opinion?" I looked at Petravich, at the jet waiting behind him, at the dogs watching with predatory intensity. "My opinion is that we can't stop him if he decides to leave. That jet will be airborne before we can get back up here. And my other opinion is that he's right. Arresting him doesn't undo anything that's already been done. That's not a moral judgment. That's pragmatism. Sometimes they're the same thing." Wolfe turned back to Petravich. "I don't condone murder, under any circumstances. Whatever justifications you offer, you took a life. That's not something I can simply accept. I'm not asking you to accept it. I'm asking you to understand it. In intelligence work, Mr. Wolfe, decisions are often between bad options and worse options. I chose the option that protected an innocent woman and exposed multiple criminals, and absolved yourself of guilt in the process. I carry guilt for many things. This is simply one more item on a very long list." Petravich dropped his cigarette and ground it out with his heel. "I came here to explain. I've done that. Whether you report this conversation is your decision, but I thought you deserved to know the truth. All of it, not just the sanitized version Miss Valdez will tell prosecutors." He started to walk back toward the jet. Wolfe watched him go, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Petravich," Wolfe called. The man stopped, turned back. "Was any of what you told us false?" "No. Everything I said about the senator, the smuggling, the investigation, was true. I simply omitted the part where I killed Malcolm Rivers. Would you have investigated differently if you'd known?" "I would have investigated with the knowledge that a murderer was orchestrating events. And would that have changed the outcome? Would Hastings still be in jail? Would Carver still be facing espionage charges? Would Volker and Castellanos still be in custody?" Wolfe was silent. "That's what I thought." Petravich turned and walked to the jet. The stairs were already down, the door open. He climbed aboard without looking back. 2 minutes later, the jet's engine started. 3 minutes after that, it was rolling down the runway, and 5 minutes later, it was gone. A silver speck disappearing into the October sky. We stood there, Wolfe and I and 5 Dobermans, watching it vanish. "We should report this," I said finally. "Yes, but will we?" Wolfe was quiet for a long moment. "Call Inspector Kramer. Tell him we have information about Malcolm Rivers' death. Tell him a man named Alexander Petravich confessed to the murder before fleeing the country. Provide his description, the aircraft's tail number, and the direction of flight. And then we return home. This case is concluded. All mysteries solved. All questions answered." He paused, however unsatisfying those answers may be. We got back in the sedan. The drive home was silent, Wolfe staring out the window, clearly processing everything we'd just learned. The Dobermans dozed in their positions, unconcerned with moral complexities. When we reached West 35th Street, Wolfe didn't go immediately to his office. He stood in the hall for a moment, Looking at the repaired windows, the glazier had done excellent work, and the cleaned carpet, evidence of last night's violence removed. "Archie," he said finally, "the check from Miss Valdez. When it arrives, I want you to donate half of it to a charitable organization. Your choice. Any particular type of charity? Something related to aviation safety, or perhaps something that helps families of crime victims. Something that acknowledges the cost of what we do, even when what we do leads to good outcomes. Especially then, because good outcomes achieved through manipulation and murder are still tainted. They're still wrong." He moved toward the office. "I'm going to spend the afternoon with my orchids. They don't lie, they don't manipulate, and they certainly don't confess to murder on remote airfields." He left. I made the call to Kramer, gave him all the information about Petravich. Kramer swore extensively, promised to notify federal authorities, and hung up muttering about spies and vigilantes and cases that should have been simple but never were. Then I sat at my desk and stared at my typewriter, trying to decide how to write up a case where we'd been manipulated by our client, guided by an intelligence operative, and ultimately served justice while being complicit in murder. In the end, I just wrote what happened. The facts, the timeline, the conclusions. Let whoever read it later decide what it meant. Outside, the October afternoon continued its progression toward evening. The city rumbled its eternal rumble, and somewhere, Flight 913 sat on a remote Canadian airstrip, evidence of a conspiracy that had touched senators and smugglers, spies and detectives. We'd solved the mystery. We'd caught the criminals. We'd done our job. But as Wolfe had said, the answers were unsatisfying, because the truth, when you finally uncover it, isn't always the neat resolution you hoped for. Sometimes, it's just complicated. And sometimes, that has to be enough. Monday morning brought Inspector Kramer back to the brownstone, this time without the urgency of gunfire or missing planes. He arrived at 11, well after Wolfe had descended from the plant rooms, and settled into the red leather chair with the weariness of a man who'd spent the weekend drowning in paperwork. Fritz brought coffee without being asked. Kramer drank half the cup in one gulp, then set it down and looked at Wolfe. "Petravich's gone. The jet landed in Belgrade. Yugoslav authorities say they have no record of anyone by that name entering the country, which means he's using a different identity now. We're not getting him back." "I didn't expect we would," Wolfe said. "The rest of it, though, that's falling into place. Hastings is cooperating, singing like he's auditioning for the Metropolitan Opera. We've got details on 47 smuggling operations over the past 3 years. Art, jewelry, some technology. Total value somewhere north of $80 million. And Mr. Hastings' legal position? He'll do time. Maybe 15 years, if he's lucky. 25 if he's not. But he's not getting the death penalty. And he's not getting life. The prosecutor thinks cooperation is worth something. And Ms. Valdez?" Kramer's expression soured. "Immunity. Full immunity, in exchange for testimony against everyone else. The senator, Hastings, Volker, Castellanos. She's the star witness against all of them. The federal prosecutor loves her, says she's credible, detailed, and sympathetic." Sympathetic. Brave whistleblower who risked her life to expose corruption. That's how they're spinning it. He reached for his coffee again. Never mind that she orchestrated an elaborate fraud, wasted thousands of hours of law enforcement time, and manipulated everyone involved to serve her own ends. "Did she break any laws?" I asked. "Probably several. But try proving it when she's got immunity, and every prosecutor in Washington wants her as a witness." Wolfe shifted in his chair. "And the senator? Arrested Saturday night in Montreal. Currently fighting extradition, but he'll lose. When he gets back to the States, he's facing espionage charges, corruption charges, and about 15 other counts. His career is over. His reputation is destroyed, and he's looking at 20 to 30 years in federal prison." Volker and Castellanos. Volker's in custody in Montreal, facing smuggling and theft charges in Canada. The US wants him extradited, but so do about 4 other countries. It'll be years before that sorts out. Castellanos tried to claim diplomatic immunity, but Portugal recalled him. He's facing charges there. Tidy, Wolfe observed. Too tidy, if you ask me. These cases don't usually wrap up this neatly. Kramer looked at Wolfe steadily. Someone orchestrated all of this. Someone who knew exactly how investigations work, how prosecutors think, how to provide evidence in a way that makes conviction almost certain. Someone with intelligence training, I suggested. Someone with intelligence training and his own agenda. Petravich played us all, Wolfe. He used Miss Valdez, he used you, he used the FBI, and now he's gone, probably living comfortably somewhere that we can't touch him. Does that trouble you, Inspector? What troubles me is that he murdered Malcolm Rivers, and we can't do anything about it. Rivers wasn't innocent. He was playing multiple sides, trying to get rich off information, but he didn't deserve to die in a hangar, because some spy decided he was a liability. No, Wolfe agreed, he didn't. They sat in silence for a moment. Outside, the city continued its Monday routine, oblivious to conspiracies and consequences. There's one more thing, Kramer said finally. Flight 913. The actual plane. The Canadians found it exactly where Valdez said it would be, private airstrip near Sherbrooke. Inside, they found Volker's cargo container. 3 paintings, like she said, all stolen from a private collection in Boston. Has the plane been returned to Transmark? Transmark doesn't exist anymore. Hastings' assets are being seized to pay restitution. The plane will probably be auctioned. The crew that flew it to Canada, they're claiming they were hired for a charter flight, didn't know anything about smuggling or conspiracies. We're still investigating, but they'll probably walk. And the regular crew, Captain Thorne and co-pilot Nguyen, they were paid $50,000 each to claim they were going to fly that route, then call in sick at the last minute. They never went near the plane. Smart of them, they can claim ignorance and probably keep their licenses. Wolfe was quiet, processing all of this. I knew that look. It meant he was assembling the full picture, understanding how all the pieces had fit together. Inspector, he said finally, in your career, how many cases have you worked where the criminal was also the victim? What do you mean? Miss Valdez was both. She was being threatened by Senator Carver, blackmailed essentially by the knowledge he possessed of her investigation. She was also orchestrating an elaborate fraud to expose him and others, victim and criminal simultaneously. That doesn't excuse what she did. No, but it explains why prosecutors are willing to grant immunity. She makes a more sympathetic witness than defendant. Kramer finished his coffee and stood. I came here to update you, and to say that despite how this turned out, despite the manipulation, despite Petravich getting away, you did good work. You uncovered the truth. That matters. Does it? When the truth is we were used as instruments in someone else's vendetta, it matters because Hastings is in jail, the senator's treason is exposed, and a smuggling ring is shut down. You did that, Wolfe. Whether or not you were manipulated into doing it, you still did it. He left. Wolfe sat in silence, staring at nothing. Caesar had moved to lie beside his chair, a silent presence. The other dogs were scattered throughout the office, each in their preferred spot. He's right, I said. We did good work. We did someone else's work. There's a difference.
Is there?
The results are the same. The methods matter, Archie. We were manipulated. That suggests we missed something, failed to see what should have been obvious. Or it suggests that Petravich is very good at his job. Former intelligence officer, remember? These people are trained to manipulate, to control information, to guide people toward conclusions without them realizing they're being guided. Wolfe was silent for a long time. Then call Saul, Fred, and Ori. I want a debriefing. I want to review every step of this investigation and identify where we should have seen the manipulation. You want to Monday morning quarterback our own case. I want to learn from our mistakes. If we don't understand how we were used, we can't prevent it from happening again. So I made the calls. By 2 o'clock, we had the full team assembled in the office. Saul, Fred, Ori, plus me and Wolfe. We went through everything, piece by piece, examining every decision, every conclusion, every moment where information had been provided to us. What we discovered was humbling. Petravich, had been masterful. Every piece of information he'd provided had been true. Nothing fabricated, nothing misleading. But the timing, the sequence, the presentation, all of it had been carefully orchestrated to lead us in specific directions. The photograph at Teterboro had confirmed the passengers were alive, pushing us away from theories about crashes. The information about Atlantic Freight Solutions had pointed us toward the smuggling operation. Valdez's sudden appearance at the brownstone had provided the framework for understanding the espionage. He never lied to us, Saul said. He just controlled what we knew, and when we knew it. And we followed along like trained seals, I added. Not seals, Wolfe corrected. Bloodhounds. We were given a scent, and we followed it to its conclusion. The fault is not in our methods, but in our failure to recognize that someone was laying the trail. Could we have recognized it? Fred asked. Wolfe considered that. Perhaps, if I'd been less focused on solving the immediate mystery and more focused on understanding who wanted it solved. But mysteries are seductive, Mr. Durkin. They engage the intellect. They promise elegant solutions. It's difficult to step back and question whether solving them serves someone else's purpose. So, what do we do differently next time? Ori asked. We ask more questions about our clients, Wolfe said. We investigate not just the mystery, but the person presenting the mystery. And we remember that information, even when true, can be a weapon as powerful as any lie. The debriefing continued for another hour. By the end, we'd identified a dozen points where we could have questioned more deeply, investigated more thoroughly, considered alternative explanations. None of them would have changed the outcome. Hastings would still be in jail, the senator would still be facing treason charges, but they would have allowed us to understand we were being manipulated. And understanding, as Wolfe often said, was the first step toward preventing it from happening again. That evening, after everyone had left, and the brownstone had settled into its usual quiet routine, I found Wolfe in the office, reading. Not a book on orchids or Byzantine history, but the complete case file I'd assembled. Every report, every note, every document related to Flight 913. Looking for something specific? I asked. Looking for the moment when I should have seen it. The moment when Petravich's hand became visible, and I can't find it, which is either testament to his skill or evidence of my declining abilities. Your abilities aren't declining, you solved the case. I solved the case I was directed to solve. That's not the same as understanding the full truth. Maybe the full truth is too complex for anyone to understand. Maybe all we can do is solve the piece in front of us and accept that there are always larger forces at work. He looked at me over his book. When did you become a philosopher? About the time I started working for a detective who thinks too much. He almost smiled. Go to bed, Archie. Tomorrow we'll return to simpler cases. Divorces, embezzlement, missing persons. Things that don't involve international conspiracies. You say that now, but next week someone will walk through that door with a mystery that sounds simple and turns out to involve, I don't know, nuclear secrets and the mafia. Then we'll deal with it then. For now I'm going to finish this book and pretend the world makes sense. I left him there, surrounded by his Dobermans and his documents, still searching for the answer to a question that might not have a satisfying resolution. Upstairs, I lay in bed thinking about the case, about Ramona Valdez, who'd survived by being smarter and more ruthless than the people who threatened her, about Alexander Petravich, who'd orchestrated everything from the shadows and escaped before justice could touch him, about Malcolm Rivers, who'd tried to play both sides and paid with his life, and about Nero Wolfe, who'd solved a mystery while being used as a tool in someone else's game. Sometimes we win, sometimes we lose, and sometimes we win and lose simultaneously, leaving us with victory that tastes like defeat. I fell asleep thinking about that, wondering if wisdom was learning to accept the ambiguity or learning to prevent it from happening again. Probably both. 3 weeks later, on a grey November afternoon, the check from Ramona Valdez arrived. It was for our full fee, $50,000, plus an additional $25,000 for damages to property and inconvenience caused. Enclosed was a brief note. Mr. Wolfe, thank you for your assistance, however involuntary it may have been. Your methods are everything Alexander said they would be. I hope the additional funds cover the window repairs. RV. I showed it to Wolfe. He read it once, then placed it in his desk drawer without comment. You want me to deposit this? I asked. Half of it. The other half goes to the charity we discussed. The Pilots Benevolent Association. They provide financial assistance to families affected by aviation accidents. It seems appropriate. Even though there was no accident, especially because there was no accident, Malcolm Rivers' family deserves something, even if they can never know why he died. I made the arrangements. The check was deposited, the donation was made, and the case file was closed and archived. Life returned to normal, or what passed for normal in a brownstone, where a detective solved mysteries from behind a desk and 5 Dobermans stood guard against threats, both real and imagined. Inspector Kramer kept us updated on the various prosecutions. Senator Carver was convicted of espionage and sentenced to 28 years in federal prison. Heinrich Volker accepted a plea agreement in Canada and was sentenced to 12 years. Dimitri Castellanos was convicted in Portugal and sentenced to 15 years. And Leonard Hastings, after cooperating extensively with prosecutors, was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. Ramona Valdez never faced charges. She testified at all 4 trials, her testimony devastating and detailed. The media portrayed her as a hero, the brave staffer who'd risked everything to expose corruption. She wrote a book about her experience, which became a bestseller. Last I heard, she was working as a political consultant in Washington, advising candidates on ethics and transparency. The irony was not lost on me. Alexander Petravich disappeared completely. Interpol had a warrant out for him, but no one expected it to be served. Men like Petravich knew how to vanish, how to become ghosts. Somewhere he was living under a new name, possibly doing similar work for different clients, always operating in the shadows where accountability couldn't reach. And Malcolm Rivers. His death was officially listed as murder by person or persons unknown. The investigation remained open, but with Petravich gone, and no other leads, it would likely remain unsolved. His family received a death benefit from the Pilots Benevolent Association, never knowing it came from money paid by the woman whose conspiracy had ultimately cost him his life. These were the loose ends, the pieces that didn't fit neatly, the parts of the case that troubled Wolfe late at night when he sat in his chair, beer in hand, thinking about justice and truth and the space between them. Now 3 weeks later, I found him in exactly that position. It was late evening, past dinner, past his usual routine. The office was dark, except for his desk lamp. The Dobermans were in their positions, Caesar at his feet, Mars by the door, Apollo at the window, Minerva near the hall, Diana at the base of the stairs. They'd become even more vigilant since the night of the gunfight, as if they understood that threats could materialize suddenly, violently, without warning. Can't sleep? I asked, settling into my desk chair. I can sleep. I choose not to. He sipped his beer. I've been thinking about Mr. Petravich's question. Which one? Would the investigation have been different if I'd known he'd killed Malcolm Rivers? Would the outcome have changed? And I don't know, which troubles me more than I care to admit. He set down his glass. We achieved justice, after a fashion. Criminals were exposed, prosecuted, imprisoned, but we did so while being manipulated by a murderer who orchestrated events to serve his own purposes. Does that taint the justice? Does it make our work less valid? I don't think so. Hastings still smuggled stolen art. The senator still committed treason. Those facts don't change based on how we learned about them. Perhaps. But our methods, our integrity as investigators, that's predicated on pursuing truth wherever it leads, not on being guided toward convenient truths by those with agendas. You think there was an inconvenient truth we missed? I think there are always inconvenient truths. The question is whether we have the courage to pursue them when doing so might undermine our success. It was the kind of philosophical conversation that Wolfe sometimes fell into late at night, when the city was quiet and the mysteries of the day gave way to larger mysteries about meaning and purpose. You know what I think, I said. I'm certain you're about to tell me. I think you did the best you could with the information available. I think you solved a complex case involving multiple crimes and multiple criminals, and I think beating yourself up because someone smarter than average managed to manipulate you is a waste of energy." "Someone smarter than average," Wolfe repeated. "Is that your assessment of Mr. Petravich? Former intelligence officer, trained in psychological operations, experienced in running covert operations across multiple countries. Yeah, I'd say he's smarter than average. The fact that he could manipulate even Nero Wolfe isn't a reflection on your abilities, it's a reflection on his." Wolfe was quiet for a long moment. "Then you're trying to make me feel better." "I'm trying to inject some perspective into your brooding."
I don't brood.
"You absolutely brood. You're brooding right now." He almost smiled. "Almost. Very well. In the interest of avoiding further accusations of brooding, I'll accept your perspective. Mr. Petravich was skilled at manipulation. We were manipulated. We still achieved a good outcome. The case is closed." "The case is closed," I confirmed. "And tomorrow?" "Tomorrow we start fresh. New cases, new mysteries, new opportunities to be brilliant and occasionally manipulated. That's a depressing summary of our profession. That's reality. We investigate crime in a world where criminals are sometimes smart, sometimes lucky, and sometimes both. Best we can do is be smarter and more persistent than they are. And when that's not enough, then we do what we did this time. We solve what we can solve. We expose what needs exposing, and we accept that perfect justice is probably impossible. Imperfect justice is better than no justice at all." He reached for his beer, found the glass empty, and looked at it with disappointment. "Fritz has gone to bed. I can get you another bottle." "No. I've had sufficient beer for one evening. And sufficient philosophy." He stood, the chair creaking its relief. "I'm going to check on the orchids, then retire. You should do the same." "In a minute. I want to finish these notes." He moved toward the door, the Doberman stirring as he passed. Caesar rose to follow him, but Wolfe gestured for the dog to stay. "Guard the office, Caesar. Archie will be up shortly." The dog settled back down, watching Wolfe leave. I heard him on the stairs, heard the elevator door open and close as he went up to the plant rooms for his final check of the evening. I sat at my desk, looking at the case file in front of me. Thick now, comprehensive, documenting everything that had happened from the moment that first cryptic message arrived. It was a complete record of investigation, deduction, conspiracy, and resolution. Everything except the truth about what Petravich had really wanted. Because I didn't believe his explanation, that he'd simply wanted to expose criminals and help Ramona Valdez. Men like Petravich always had deeper agendas, hidden purposes that only became visible long after the immediate events had concluded. What had he really wanted? What had he accomplished beyond the obvious prosecutions? Maybe we'd never know. Maybe that was the price of dealing with people who operated at that level. You never understood the full picture, only the parts they wanted you to see. I closed the case file, locked it in the filing cabinet, and turned off my desk lamp. Outside, West 35th Street was quiet. A few cars passing, a few pedestrians hurrying home through the November cold, the city settling into its nighttime rhythms. Caesar remained at his post near Wolfe's desk. Mars was at the door. Apollo at the window, Minerva and Diana on either side of the hall. 5 Dobermans, 5 silent sentinels, watching over a brownstone where a detective solved mysteries and occasionally got manipulated by people smarter than average. "You guys did good," I told them. "The gunfight thing, that was excellent work. Very professional." Caesar looked at me with those dark, intelligent eyes, as if acknowledging the compliment. I went upstairs, past the plant rooms where Wolfe was communing with his orchids, past the guest rooms that were rarely used, to my own room at the top of the house. Before I turned off the light, I looked out the window at the city spread below. Somewhere out there, Ramona Valdez was building her new career. Somewhere, Leonard Hastings was beginning his prison sentence. Somewhere, Alexander Petravich was living under a new name, possibly planning new operations, possibly retired. And here, in this brownstone, Nero Wolfe would wake tomorrow morning, tend his orchids, descend at 11 o'clock, and sit behind his desk ready to solve whatever mystery walked through the door. Because that's what we did. That's what we'd always do. Mysteries would come. We'd investigate them, we'd solve them, and occasionally we'd discover that solving them had been someone else's plan all along. But we'd keep doing it anyway, because the alternative was accepting that complexity, manipulation, and ambiguity meant we should stop trying. And Nero Wolfe, for all his eccentricities, his refusal to leave the brownstone, his obsession with orchids and beer and routine, would never accept that. Neither would I. I turned off the light and went to bed, knowing that tomorrow would bring new cases, new challenges, new opportunities to prove that even in a world of shadows and manipulation, truth could still be pursued. And sometimes, if we were lucky and persistent and maybe a little bit brilliant, truth could still be caught, even when it didn't want to be. It was a Tuesday in February when the final piece arrived. Not a letter, not a message, not a mysterious package, just a newspaper clipping, sent in an unmarked envelope with a Zurich postmark. The clipping was from the International Herald Tribune, dated 3 days earlier. It reported the death of Viktor Petrov, the Russian intelligence officer, in what was described as a tragic accident in Belgrade. According to the article, Petrov had fallen from a hotel balcony under circumstances that authorities were still investigating. But no arrests had been made, no suspects identified. The case was likely to remain unsolved. I showed it to Wolfe during his office hours. He read it carefully, then set it down and looked at me. "Mr. Petravich's final contribution to our education," he said. "You think he killed Petrov?" "I think Petrov was the real target all along. The senator was selling information to him. Petravich, as a former counterintelligence officer, would have considered that unacceptable. Everything else, the smuggling investigation, the exposure of Hastings and Volker, those were secondary objectives. Convenient, but secondary. So he used us to expose the senator's treason, which led to Petrov's exposure, which allowed Petravich to, what? Eliminate him quietly. Precisely. With Petrov publicly identified as the recipient of classified information, his usefulness to Russian intelligence was finished. He became a liability. Eliminating him became not just possible, but acceptable to certain parties who might otherwise have protected him. That's remarkably cold-blooded. That's intelligence work, Archie. Mr. Petravich told us he carried guilt for many things. I suspect Viktor Petrov's death won't be among them. I looked at the clipping again, thinking about the layers of manipulation, the cascading consequences, the fact that even now, 3 months later, we were still discovering dimensions of the case we hadn't understood. "He's not going to contact us again, is he?" I asked. "No. His work is finished. We served our purpose. There's no reason for further communication." "Do you wish there was?" Wolfe considered that. "No. I'm content to let Mr. Petravich remain in his shadows, pursuing whatever vendettas and operations occupy him. As long as they don't involve this brownstone, he's welcome to operate however he chooses. And if they do involve this brownstone, then the Dobermans will be ready." I filed the clipping with the rest of the case materials, adding one final note to the file. Subject Petravich continues operations. Viktor Petravich deceased. Circumstances suspicious. Case truly closed. Then I locked the cabinet and returned to my desk, where a new case file was waiting. Something about embezzlement at a textile company. Straightforward and uncomplicated. Exactly the kind of case we needed after Flight 913. Wolfe had already moved on, reading a new book about medieval agriculture, utterly absorbed. The Dobermans were in their positions, watchful but calm. Outside, the city rumbled its eternal rumble, indifferent to conspiracies past and present. And in the brownstone on West 35th Street, life continued, one case after another, one mystery after another, one truth pursued after another. Because that's what we did. That's what we'd always do. No matter who tried to use us, manipulate us, or direct us toward convenient truths. We'd keep pursuing the inconvenient ones too, even when, especially when they didn't want to be found.